Hey, Sovereign Wealth Builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. Of course, what else are we going to be talking about this week? Big news. And we're going to be going through everything that's going to be happening and what has happened with the Iran war and analyzing it against our long-term thesis that this Iran war is in fact the global reset and a transition to this multipolar world order that we've been discussing. I'll be analyzing in terms of what happened in the markets, what I think comes next, what I was saying previously, what I got wrong, what I got right, and where I think everything goes and what the market is telling us. So buckle up. We're going to be doing this in two parts today, as we did last week. In part one, we're going to be going through Iran war week one. So we're about 6.5 days in. It kicked off just after Simon Dixon Hard Talk live last week. And we were talking previously in previous episodes about the outcomes that we expected to come from this, what I call a managed transition to a multipolar world. Now, some people have been tweeting me saying, Simon, it looks like you're vindicated and you're right. Others have been saying, Simon, you got things wrong. We're going to be reviewing it, and you can let me know in the comments what you think in terms of if you are a long-term listener. Not only that, I'm going to go through everything that happened this week, what the markets are saying, what I think comes next based upon following the money. And then in part two today, I'm going to bring someone in that completely disagrees with me. And so I did a debate with Ryan Dawson, and we were debating really whether this is Israel's war or whether this is part of propping up the US empire and a managed transition. And so I want to make sure, because many people are really thinking about whether this is just a war for Israel or whether there's something else going on. And so if you if you go over to my blog on SimonDixon.com, in terms of covering like the Epstein files, JFK, 9/11, various other blackmail operations, Ryan Dawson has spent about 20 years on this subject. And so I've used many of his documentaries and I give my commentary around it whenever I'm covering one of these topics. But in terms of who's in charge, what the implications are and what comes next, we differ. So we had a really heated debate. It was a respectful debate, but it was very heated as well. So we're going to be playing that. And really, we want to answer the question, does Israel really control US foreign policy? And that's going to be a debate between myself and Ryan Dawson that sit on very differing opinions in terms of the power structure and why this war is happening, which also has implications in terms of what comes next. And if US loses a war, if Iran loses a war, what the implications are. Now, I think it's way more nuanced, and we're going to jump straight into that in this episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. Okay, so let's jump right in with part one, the Iran war, week one. And I'm hoping it's only going to be another week or so, that it's similar to the last 12-day wars, even though there is significant difference in terms of the impact. And this is going to be the managed transition to a multipolar world. So firstly, let's make sure that we set some parameters, because there is a mainstream narrative and it depends which side of the propaganda you sit on. Now, the mainstream narrative is that we are currently in a war between Iran, Israel, and US. And this will potentially, if it goes wrong, escalate to World War III, because America, one global superpower, nuclear superpower, is with the largest military budget in the world, is already in the war. On the other side, you have Iran, and Iran is strategically aligned with Russia and China and other superpowers that definitely have nuclear power. And so the definition of World War III is when two major nuclear powers are in direct war rather than a proxy war. And that means a real war, which I personally believe everything we're witnessing right now is to prevent World War III. And we'll go through my thinking, my arguments, the markets, and why this is. So that's the mainstream narrative. There is a war between Iran, Israel, US, and this could potentially escalate to World War III. And some are saying the US has overstepped. Others are saying the US is crushing it. And it depends which side of the propaganda you sit on. Now, in one version of the world, when you're talking about Iran, there is Iran that is pointed in Western media, either media that is controlled by the West, by the UK, by the BBC, by Fox, by CNN, by any Israel-aligned Zionist factions of the media, that it will point out that Iran is effectively the head of the snake of the Islamist terrorist group, and it is a nuclear threat. And that nuclear threat has used Israel in order to tame that nuclear threat. And we've been told for 40 years that Iran is 2 weeks away from having a nuclear bomb. And the narrative that led up to this is that Iran is killing people and Trump needs to save the day. And then the Ayatollah said, no, we agreed not to hang people. And Trump said, we don't need to save the day. And now the back and forth is we are decimating any of the ballistic missiles, the nuclear threat, because allegedly there is a threat that these nuclear weapons, which are meant to exist, even though from her testimony at the beginning of the Trump administration, saying that there is no nuclear weapons, we're now told that even though during the 12-day war, Trump told us that he obliterated the nuclear threat, apparently the nuclear threat has come back again. And now it is pointed at Europe and pointed at states in America, and therefore is a threat to the American people and the Western civilization. And therefore, we need to have a war in order to protect the American people from the global center of terrorism. That's one narrative if you sit in the MAGA Western mainstream media indoctrinated part of the world. Now, there is another side which is extreme propaganda as well. If you listen to the Iran side of the propaganda, then Iran is pointed out as an anti-imperial that is fighting against all imperial threats. And it is really the last resistance that is resisting and is purely honorable and purely theological and fighting for, a holy war, a jihad, in order to maintain the preservation of an anti-imperialist movement that everybody else has sold out and is a Zionist bootlicker and effectively normalized. And therefore, Iran is the last force with this axis of resistance that is essentially fighting for Palestinian rights, fighting for Lebanese rights, fighting for Yemeni rights, and so on and so forth. And so both of those are really the two sides of the propaganda. And you can spend your time going on a YouTube video, where they will tell you everything about how Iran is in this holy war, or on the other side, how America is kicking ass and taking out the nuclear threat. Or you can sit on a pro-Israeli space that will tell you that this is the quote-unquote Islamist terrorist and various other things. All of those are cartoon characters designed for the lowest denominator of stupidity in order to create the rhetoric and the narrative around what this war is really about, which is really about resource extraction, choke points, and various other things that companies need in order to have inputs into the means of production. So if you listen to the Iran propaganda, essentially it is the last defender of the Palestinian cause. Basically both are complete PR and propaganda in order to make you feel a certain way so that you can justify what is currently happening and the narrative. Now, another thing is, what is this really? I personally believe another one that is framed is that the cartoon character wants you to believe that there is good and there is evil. And this is a spiritual battle between good and evil. And depending on which side you are on and which side wins, good prevails or evil prevails. My thesis is that this is not an existential war. because now we are talking about there is an existential threat where Iran will either look like Syria, look like Libya, look like Iraq, and all the different operations, or Afghanistan, that we have seen when America was the sole global hegemon of the world, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and we entered into this fiat currency debt-based standard in 1971. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, we entered into the global hegemon, where a military-industrial complex formed a proof of weapons network that took the post-World War II Bretton Woods order, where everyone was converting their currencies into gold, and instead we entered into a debt-based fiat currency standard where US government debt became the collateral, and covert regime changes and operations became the mechanism for enforcing dollar debt on the world so that everybody would purchase those treasuries. And by pricing certain resources in dollars, you could force dollars on the world, and therefore American debt could expand. It could have its twin deficit where it spends more than it brings in taxes. It exports more than it imports. And effectively, I believe that that system is at the end of a debt cycle. If you're a long-term listener to Simon Dixon Hard Talk, we've been covering this for years. And we've been leading up to this transition. And this transition is really between two transnational power structures. And those power structures, people find hard to believe because they still have not figured out that governments have been captured by the proof of weapons network, by transnational capital, by the financial industrial complex that use central banking, fiat currencies, investment banking, retail banking, asset management, private equity, public equity, in order to, and asset management, in order to reset the flows of capital, in order to take over and make government subordinate to that corporate interest. And that corporate interest is not America first. It's not Iran first. It's not Europe first. It's not Australia first. It's not UK first. It is transnational capital first. And it will go wherever it needs to go in order to reset the world order. And it will use financial weapons of mass destruction. So now let's look at a less cartoonish version of the world. It starts with your central banking system, your resources, your choke points, and your sovereign wealth funds determine whether you are a sovereign country that can focus on your individual and your people, or whether you are a corporate captured, and therefore you only focus on the returns of the shareholder class. And the West is fully captured by this proof of weapons network, this financial industrial complex. And now, by controlling access to capital, you control the military industrial complex, the technical industrial complex, and the media in order to perpetuate narrative. The army in a country like this is like a pay-for-rent militia to transnational capital. You can send it to go and get resources, and then you can build models that profiteer from war or profiteer from Build Back Better. And then when you build back better, you integrate it into a police and surveillance state via the technical industrial complex. War is simply a mechanism that is used in order to basically recollaborate or reorganize, let's say, the system. And so the financial industrial complex are effectively, one side of this power structure, and it is transnational. It doesn't represent the American interest. And so they are effectively, in my map of the world, by following the money and through any of my videos, if you're a long-term listener, they are currently running an experiment. And this experiment is being run via the Strait of Hormuz, which is effectively one of the strategic choke points that is effective for so many imports and exports in the world that, if shut, can reset the world order in a pre-negotiated way between global powers and those that have leverage in this transnational capital network that we've always talked about. And so when you shut the Strait of Hormuz, you're able to observe and you're able to study basically the worldwide impact on every single commodity and every single resource that is required, not every single one, but all the major ones, as well as every single economic and political reaction to the fact that those flows are being reset. And so this is essentially transforming the world into multipolarity based upon who gets a seat at the table. Who gets a seat at the table? The countries with the largest gold reserves, the countries with strategic choke points, the countries that have sovereign wealth funds, and the countries that are not subordinate to transnational capital. The entire West is subordinate to this transnational capital. So when you think of the world like this, in terms of what is the war being fought right now, you'll be able to understand that there are two factions of power that are driving this conflict right now. One is what I've always called the financial industrial complex. What does the financial industrial complex want out of this war? Well, this is the faction of power that is effectively wants the returns of stability within the Middle East. It also wants to transition to a multipolar world. It is hosted primarily in America, but it partners with other sovereign wealth funds in order to set the world order and determine, based upon the leverage and how well this game is played, and who controls access to the most capital and strategic choke points, who gets to rent the US military and use it, for the fact that it is the largest $1 trillion budget that exists in the world. Now, what is the goal of the financial industrial complex right now? As I said, I believe that it wants, in this case, it's not always the case, and it's not the same for other regions, but in the case of the Middle East, right now, for many reasons that I've told you, and I'll recap again today, it wants, in the Middle East, for the first time since the Ottoman Empire, since Sykes-Picot Act, when the French and the Brits all carved up the Middle East in order to push the forever war model to fuel the military-industrial complex and gain access to vast oil resources that were needed post-industrial revolution time. They want regional stability within the Middle East, and they want global economic integration of all factions that have kind of been pariah states, or they have not opened up to this financial industrial complex. So who are the players that are aligned in this faction of power? I believe that it is the sovereign wealth funds, and the biggest sovereign wealth funds are the Gulf Cooperation Council that consists of the GCC, which is headed by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, all the countries that are currently having their US bases bombed right now. And it also is global capital. This is infrastructure investors. This is, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, and basically the financial industrial complex that is aligned with these transnational capital. It is also a sovereign nation, China. And China has got significant leverage because it has the largest manufacturing base and it has the largest reserves in terms of, well, unreported, America's got the largest gold reserves, but most people believe that China has the largest gold reserves and it has a ginormous trade surplus. But it is effectively the China that brokered the normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Iran and Saudi Arabia aligning via China changed everything, as we've been covering from the long for that. Now, what does that mean? Now, most people think of Iran as, a monolith, but it's not. As with any country, you have different factions of power. You have those that profiteer from wars. You have those that represent a militarized force. You have those that represent a different type of party. But within Iran, you have something called the reformists. And the reformists is effectively the Iranian government. And the Iranian government is the one that sits down with all these diplomatic negotiations and is also the faction that I believe is aligned with China and is therefore aligned with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and is therefore aligned with the Western financial industrial complex. Now, there is also a part of, just like with any political system, there are people that hate Trump, there are people that like Republican or people that like Democrats, and there is very, very different ideological views. Within the IRGC, which is the military arm, of the Iran, in the West they would call the Iranian regime. There is a pragmatic element of the IRGC, which is a faction that is willing to transition to a model that normalizes with Saudi Arabia and is able to manage a transition into more of a vision that satisfies the reformist government's version of the world. And this is really represented, if you look at Iranian politics, by Przezeshkian. Przezeshkian effectively was, I believe, in my opinion, and this is speculation, after the helicopter came down and took out the defense minister and Iranian prime minister, when that happened, Przezeshkian was the one that was via a process where the IRGC or the Grand Leader Khamenei, who has been taken out in this operation, he would have said, here are the candidates that you can vote between. And there was a democratic process in order to install that. Now, Przezeshkian represents a faction that was negotiating with America and would also have a very important relationship in China. I think that is the faction of the Iranian government that is for this transition. There is also somebody that you will see in the media that is, I got to make sure I get the names right. Aragachi, that is represented basically in IRGC, has a background in IRGC, but has also been sat down at the table representing somebody that has the respect that could negotiate between the reformist view of the world within Iran and the IRGC hardliners view of the world that effectively has been in a state of militarized, defense or aggression, depending on which side of the propaganda you sit in. And Arachi effectively represents that faction of power within the IRGC that's able to do that. You also have somebody called, I'm probably going to butcher the name, Ali Lanjeni, and also a post. These are the people that represent the government, as it were, in both the IRGC and the reformist faction right now. From my perspective, I believe that those are the people that are left right now, and there are more people left. And this will become very important when we start to try and predict, by following the money, what the market is telling us and what this looks like as well. Now, there is also, I believe, within Israel, a effective, after a post-Netanyahu government or a post-Netanyahu, what we call coalition, and that's a coalition between the radical Zionists that are funding the terrorism in the West Bank, where it's state-sponsored, the Ben-Gvirs, the Smoldriches, that have been funding these illegal Israeli settlements and providing, relief to the terrorist factions within Israel and the Zionists that have been chucking people out of their home and, terrorizing the Palestinians. There will be a post-government, which it represents a post-Netanyahu government. Let's call it the left, if you want. There is a movement within Israel which represents the left, which recognizes that, Palestinian statehood needs to be achieved, and it recognizes the illegal occupation, and it's not radicalized into the extremist version that the IDF kind of represents. And so I believe that's a very small faction within Israel, but a faction that will exist once Netanyahu kind of has his regime change after these operations. So you've got those people that are pushing for, I think, one side of regional stability. Now, what do they want? They want a stable Middle East. And what does that mean? That at the end of this, effectively, there is energy security, there is a stable environment in order to facilitate investments, there is trade integration, based upon countries that may not like each other, but geopolitically have to get on. And they represent effectively the end of the forever war model in the Middle East, which was antagonized and engineered by Western powers. Firstly, the British Empire, then the American Empire. And so if you genuinely do have peace in the Middle East, then you have a multipolar world order, because you have China and BRICS on one side, you have the Gulf that are able to build sovereign wealth funds and unify around their resources, diversify, and create a coalition called the Gulf Cooperation Council that is then able to normalize without an external antagonist that is funded by the US military industrial complex. And once you have that, you have a multipolar world order. That is the world that we've never lived in before. Now, you have another faction of power, which is used to the US being the global hegemon. It was the same faction that wanted to create a system that got everybody to drop their gold pegs of their currencies, peg it to the US dollar, set up the Bretton Woods world order, have United Nations that was able to get America to, pardon any crimes against humanity that it did globally, had a World Bank that got the world in debt in dollars, and had an IMF system and a USAID and a deep state via the CIA connected to Mossad and MI6 and legacy powers that would effectively profiteer from war and would have a model for getting the resources that it wanted, regime changing governments, installing dictators and bribing them so that the countries would effectively print their currency into oblivion and force them into purchasing dollars that head up the dollar standard. Now, this military industrial complex is basically a state and a faction of America, call it the deep state, that benefits from permanent conflict. Now, the issue is that with China rising, that power of that faction of power doesn't exist anymore. And so because the financial industrial complex is global in nature, the military industrial complex is somewhat more nationalistic, whereas the financial industrial complex is less nationalistic. What is the goal of the military industrial complex? Well, it is to maintain instability around the world, always fuel wars, and use proxies and deception and deep state operations in order to make sure the world can never be at peace. And this is effectively the faction that propped up the US dollar, propped up world reserve currency, and represents the US hegemony that existed up until basically when the dollar started being weaponized and the de-dollarization mission started to play. Now, who are the players on the other side of this war? So remember, it's not nationalistic. You've got the financial industrial complex and their allies. And then you've got the military industrial complex and their allies. So who's aligned with the military industrial complex? Well, effectively, it is the IRGC hardliners. The IRGC hardliners have always benefited from the fact that sanctions were enforced and they create strategic tension. If you read a book like by Paul Williams, like Operation Gladio, where these covert operations effectively aligned factions of power in Iran with factions of power with US and factions of power within Israel, just like we saw in the Iran-Contra affair, where there was a deep state mechanism for trafficking weapons, money laundering, and benefiting and profiteering from a continual state of war and strategic tension. This is the faction that for 40 years would have a death to America flag that was very useful in America engaging in propaganda so that they could say that Israel is under threat, and Israel would then come along and say, we're taking out, this is the head of the snake, And there would never, ever be a war between an actual direct war between Iran and Israel, but there would always be profiteering from war. This is a faction that's taken $10 trillion of American debt and set a covert operation that benefits from a continual state of war. Now, people put emotions on top of this. This is geopolitical reality. And once you have essentially a corrupt network because of sanctions with the mafia that has to engage in trafficking operations to prop up their power structure, you then get self-interested people that benefit, and it creates a power structure which is subordinate, which the government can be subordinate to, just like we see in America. You have corporate interests and the government is subordinate via lobbies. It's a different process within Iran, but every country has their oligarchy. They have their different factions of power. It's not a monolith. So the IRGC hardliners effectively benefit from a continual state of war. And if that war comes to an end, the justification for Israel, who works for the US military-industrial complex, plus the Israeli military-industrial complex, plus the deep state, MI6, Mossad, CIA operations that can do all the illegal stuff that creates this continual state of war, Israel is no longer useful to the military-industrial complex if the IRGC hardliners are no longer with us in that reality. And so this is the radical Zionist faction of Israel. This is represented by Netanyahu, and he is subordinate, as with any government in the West, to its military profiteers. This is the faction that talks about the Greater Israel Project. The Greater Israel Project is effectively a destabilization campaign. It benefits from a continual state of tension, and you can radicalize and build an army based upon the weaponization of religion in order to recruit people into that ideology. This is also the US radicalized Zionists that when 9/11 came down, the evangelical Christians and the anti-Islamist kind of movement was created upon, always believing that, there are groups that want to kill Americans, death to America, that type of faction that was always, many of these groups were funded via USAID, Department of Government Efficiency revealed that. You can see it in Epstein files. You can see it in the WikiLeaks documents, in the Hillary Clinton email WikiLeaks, when they were talking about Al-Qaeda being able to rent them. So this is an ideology where effectively, this Zionist entity, whether it be Christians and Jews, or whether it be just profiteers because they're funded by lobby groups, take your pick. But that's the faction that is aligned with the military-industrial complex, because that's the narrative that was built to justify war. They weaponize religion. They create these groups after war, and they create strategic tension all around, and they make sure that there is always a justification for the Pentagon allocating those budgets to Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Raytheon, now is Palantir, and various other factions. These are effectively those within Congress, Senate, and judicial that may receive deep state bribes, that may receive lobby financing, and are aligned with organizations like AIPAC. And AIPAC is, there are higher levels, military lobbying as well. But these are the factions within America that are aligned with, let's take out Iran, let's remove the nuclear threat. Really the cartoon character on top of that is Lindsey Graham, and these type of people, the types of people that Tucker Carlson has kind of been engaging in de-radicalization operations to weaken the military-industrial complex faction of support for Zionism that allowed for this strategic tension, that allowed for this, money printing and war, because greater powers, the financial industrial complex, is probably engaging in operations to de-radicalize people to manage this transition. Now, what is the military-industrial complexes? Their faction of power. So you can see this is transnational. It's too simplistic to think of country versus country once you understand power dynamics and how the world really works. Now, what is their goal? Their objective is to continually increase weapon sales because they're owned by the military lobby. And their job is to always push a narrative. And if they don't fulfill that, they don't get access to funding, they get blackmail operations, they get different various other things. But these are the people that are basically on the side of military power. And those are the same ones that want America to have a hegemony that forces the world onto the dollar standard by having US military bases across the world. Think of the British Empire when it fell. It had its colonies all over the world. Well, America, when it became the military industrial complex and took all the power from the British Empire, it effectively built all these US bases around the world that would be responsible for executing these covert operations and making sure that war profiteering always exists. This is the wartime economy. This is the war is a racket. This is the mechanism for always making sure that the dollar is propped up and backed by war. And so this really represents the narrative of American strength. You know, the cartoon character of US geopolitical dominance. We will always be the greatest. We're the best. You know, the belief that we're the most ethical, we're exporting democracy, that was kind of destroyed by the Epstein files being released when you realize it was backing up human trafficking, weapons trafficking, sex trafficking, drug trafficking. And it was backed up by, let's call it as a joke, the Epstein class, the brutal Epstein regime, to quote unquote, you know, it's a bit tongue in cheek, but that's the allied version of the military industrial complex. Now, what are the key threats to this faction of power? So you see that it's transnational. Those factions of power exist within every company. And these are the ones that I believe is really at war right now. Well, financial industrial complex capital and military industrial complex capital, where does the MIC capital come from? Well, it comes from Pentagon budget. So the $1 trillion increased to $1.5 trillion. But what is the financial industrial complex capital? That's BlackRock, that's State Street, that's Vanguard, that's the sovereign wealth funds. That's China as well, faction of power. That's a significantly greater multi-trillion-dollar budget. And so the military is also public companies. Those public companies, they can be threatened with dividends, share buybacks, financial weapons of mass destruction, derivatives markets, as we always cover. So they are subordinate to the financial industrial complex, but they have a weapon in themselves. They have the deep state, CIA, Mossad, MI6 covert operations. They have the mafia operations. And so they're able to weaponize that in their battle against the faction of power that represents the FIC. And so MIC capital is basically interconnected with FIC capital, and normally they're aligned, but sometimes they're not aligned. Because if you're partnering with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund that wants Saudi Arabia to be the regional hegemon, then they're able to exert influence over BlackRock, and BlackRock ends up by trying to get IPOs like Saudi Aramco and becoming one of the largest foreign institutional shareholders, even though 99% of it is still controlled by Saudi, financiers and oligarchs and monarchies. You can get a board seat on BlackRock and you can influence US foreign policy. US has $65 trillion of foreign-owned capital. And so foreign capital controls, this financial industrial complex, US foreign policy. Now you have deep state factions, that's where Israel comes in, and you have this power struggle that can create war, stop war. They're normally aligned, but sometimes you enter into a power struggle. We are in such a power struggle right now. Now, a deal is likely to exist between both the MIC and the FIC. But the result of this type of dynamics is the MIC gets a war. That negotiation could look like, all right, you get a war. You get to rinse out all the final weapons of both the Israeli factions and the American factions. And then once that reaches a point where you have to replenish and get more Pentagon budget, the financial industrial complex gets essentially the post-war architecture and reconstruction. They get the reconstruction contracts, and they will be negotiating with other factions of power in the sovereign factions of power. And they would also look to install their technical industrial complex, their police and surveillance state. Now, whether that data, just like Anthropic is involved in the war right now, the Anthropic is pushing out a narrative that they're not going to allow the US military to use their fully autonomous weapons. What do foreign sovereign wealth funds say? Well, we'll use Anthropic. And so this could be an international strategy. Now, they want to get leverage over NVIDIA, chip manufacturing, various other factions. And they'll say, right, we need you to build your data centers in our country because we want to control the data. And so all of that has been negotiated before we enter into the full transition to a multipolar world. And you can put a wild card out there. You can go off script. You might agree a deal, but then you decide to go off script. And when you go off script, that resets the negotiation, and it either ruins your credibility, gets you some more profiteering, or delays so that the financial industrial complex that's looking out for their portfolio companies get some more contracts in the technical industrial complex as well. So the war becomes essentially a transition mechanism, a narrative mechanism, a mechanism for implementing a soft landing so that the order can be reset, but you apply pressure via controlling and closing strategic choke points. This is what I think we're in right now. So my last broadcast on the topic, I basically said that I believe we are going to enter into a similar operation like the 12-day war. And the 12-day war, I would call it theatrics. I'm going to make sure we understand that, and we're going to define it. But the end result will be, I might get the details wrong, and I have got the details wrong in the last 12-day war. I didn't think that we needed, to go into the 12-day war and there would be direct conflict between Iran and Israel. But once I did the analysis on it, you can see my blog, go to SimonDixon.com, and you can go back and put in the play-by-play of the Iran-US Israel war. I said that this is managed theater in order to manage that transition. Now, what did I say in my last broadcast would be the result of the current war? I said Israel will be weaker. It will be vassalized through debt and privatization contracts into the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. It will eventually be regime changed so that you get a left government that will work with not the military industrial complex, but the financial industrial complex. Netanyahu is representing that transition. He needs to provide utility to MIC while it switches to providing more land so that when FIC negotiates Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, the future of Israel, it's got leverage against the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund. So in order for Netanyahu to remain in power, he needs to provide utility to the MIC transition to the FIC. And the war would always be the actual optics that are required in order to manage that transition. So not only will Israel be laden with debt, remember, when Iran fires its weapons at Israel, it costs 2 to 3 times more in order to defend against them. So you get laden with debt. The stock market is stimulated via the Israeli military MIC and the US MIC. But the privatization means that the state has less power. Private interest is able to negotiate with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds. The Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds wants a different version of Israel that is not an antagonist for US MIC profiteering. Now, what do they want? Well, I also said that Iran would be weaker because Iran would fire off all its weapons and it would be vassalized into China. China has a version of the government or the government and the leadership within Iran that it would be pushing for. And it would be pushing for headed up to April, where we will have the Xi Jinping and Trump meeting in April. So Iran will be weaker, but it will have a version of the government at the end of it that is aligned with China, aligned with transnational capital, and aligned with the financial industrial complex. So you'll have a weaker Iran at the end of it. And you need to have certain, rather than external regime change where you install a Western puppet, you need an internal regime change. You need those that are left and around the negotiation table within Iran to be left. And anyone that's not on board with that vision, just like maybe Maduro wasn't, they get eliminated. The rest get integrated. And so the people are being used as puppets, thinking that they're going to save Iran, that they're going to save the Iranian people. All of that is BS. There is going to be an IRGC that is aligned, in my opinion, with the reformist government, that's aligned with China, that's aligned with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund, that's aligned with the financial industrial complex, and the US military industrial complex needs to be weaker. So I said last week, speculatively, what if Iran blows up all the US military bases and effectively transnational capital is hiring Iran in order to agitate the blowing up of the regions that would effectively be empty buildings? And there would be key buildings that represent US power in the Gulf and the Middle East that are now effectively renegotiated, aligned with China, aligned with Russia, and also purchase some of those US new artificial intelligence contracts, but get the data centers in the Middle East as you transition energy and reset the world order on agreed terms based upon real superpowers, China, American corporate power, and Russia as well. So you would need those US military bases to be weaker, which was the mechanism for propping up the petrodollar. Now, I will admit, this is way bigger than I predicted. I thought we were going to get something like the 12-day war, but I still think we're on the same plan. And I still think that we are on a managed transition. And so I did last week on my show, called it the final war, to basically reset the world order. I believe now that once you enter this war, the factions in the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex have already set their strategy and their terms. And they are maximizing this transition right now. And we are witnessing in real time the global reset. As I said, if you want to see my full post analysis of the 12-day war, go over to SimonDixon.com. And I had a blog where I went through the whole thing, play by play. I went through the financial transactions, the debt to GDP that went up, the privatization programs. We then had Israel aligning with India and UAE that will be purchasing many of those military industrial complex assets as we enter into the next phase. So now what I want to do is I want to go through week one, and I want to go through the timeline and what we have seen since my last week's episode and since everything kicked off on Saturday. So I also want to cover the expected end state, and if I'm wrong, I will review that next week until we're done. Now, here's what I think the likely outcomes are and why I still think this is going to be a similar time frame to a 12-day war. Now, maybe it's longer. I don't know. But my anticipation of markets right now is that markets are telling me that the markets believe this is going to have an off-ramps and it's going to end within a similar time frame to the 12-day war. Now, what will be the end outcome? I believe it will be Iran normalization with a narrative that IRGC more normalized members are still there and it didn't get regime changed. I believe that there will also be an Iran institutional, basically an institutional state that is kind of has a reformed IRGC. Anybody that is from the hardliner faction that would not agree to this has either already been eliminated or will be eliminated. So the regime change is not external to have a US puppet. It is purely internal. So the US at the end of this will get its victory narrative. It will claim victory. It will say, we took out Khomeini, we took out the head of the snake, we eliminated the nuclear program, we took out the ballistic missiles, but all of what is needed has already been agreed by the factions of power that I believe are allowing that to happen, aligned with the FIC. Now, the GCC gains regional autonomy so that it is more regionally, able to take those US bases, and rather being a tool for US imperial power, they get to align around all factions of power in a multipolar world, whether it be Egypt, whether it be Turkey, whether it be Pakistan, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, and whether it be US MiC that would have needed compensation in order to allow the FIC to win this battle and execute this transition. And so the IRGC hardliners will be removed, and the ones that are remained will be integrated. And this basically means, that that marks the end of Israel's utility as a MiC antagonizer as well. And so what did we have right after, or on my last episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live? I think it was February the 27th. We had we had negotiations in Amman. And in Amman, it set a framework. And what I think that was essentially the framework for the negotiation. Now, if you remember, Amman came out and said we had the IRGC members and those that are still alive today that were sat around the table. They were negotiating, and they said that they'd already agreed to zero nuclear enrichment based upon a framework of terms. It might mean that Russia takes the enriched uranium. It might be that China provides security guarantees. It might be whatever they had agreed, but a framework had already been agreed. Now, this is the speculative part on my side. I believe that what we are witnessing right now is still part of the negotiations. And that is that there will be war, and that war will result in the Strait of Hormuz being closed. And what will be the end result of the off-ramps? The off-ramps will be that the Strait of Hormuz has a reopening guarantee. And those involved in the markets that can move the markets right now, I believe they know when it will be reopened. And they are insider trading based upon that. The end result will also be, not only will the Strait of Hormuz be closed and then reopened, it will also have sanctions relieved as part of the plan with Iran that will be based upon a staged agreement that involves China and the factions of power in regional power that I talked about. They will have Iran security guarantees as well. It will also make sure that within Israel, eventually there is a regime change, whether it be via the political process, whether it be via an uprising of Israelis investigating what happened on October the 7th, whether it be just the normal political process when later this year it goes into elections. But the cabinet will be collapsed that represents Netanyahu. Then you will have a government that is aligned with the GCC and what has been negotiated within the border peace mechanism, which will lead to a Palestinian state and a model of the Build Back Better model that will be primarily funded by the GCC sovereign wealth funds with bribes for Trump via Affinity Capital and Jared Kushner, which will profit from regional stability, as well as the Israeli oligarchs that need to be profiteering from a regional stability vision. And so that will lead to that regime change in a post-Netanyahu Israel. And what is effectively, I said that this would be theater. Now, admittedly, this is way more aggressive, which means to me, this is the final deal. I don't think we end up in peace and then come back to another one. That's my initial assessment of this situation. Now, people have been saying to me, are you saying that you think everything's fake? I want to define what I defined in my previous thing of what theater actually is. What it effectively means is that the conflict that we're witnessing right now is real. It's happening. There are people dying. There are factions of power that need to be eliminated. But the total conflict is bounded so that it doesn't turn into something like Syria, like Iraq, like Russia, Ukraine, that was genuine wars that were not meant to be bounded and were not agreed in terms of what happens. The Syria leadership transition was an agreement between world powers. Russia would have agreed, China would have agreed, Turkey would have agreed, the Gulf countries would have agreed, American factions of power would have agreed. And then suddenly, the rebels are allowed to come in, and then suddenly the leadership is removed. And then you get a transition placeholder government funded by Turkey and the GCC. And then you get the Israeli factions of power. They go engage into negotiation And then Gilani, the leader of Syria, goes over to Trump and negotiates what the banks get out of this equation. And then eventually sanctions are relieved, and then you get all the growth and the front running of the deal. Similar things here. But obviously, Iran is a very, very different beast. And so I believe everything in terms of the conflict is bounded to agreed parameters. And sometimes factions of power go out of those agreed parameters, or they're not around the table. But it means that there is an agreed outcome, and very significant factions of power are doing whatever it takes to reach that agreed outcome. Now, what gets shut down or shot down by any of these ballistic missiles or drones or anything is basically meant to get shot down. So if a fighter jet gets shot down, it's symbolic and it's meant to get shot down. If an American military base gets shot down, it's symbolic and it's meant to get shot down. What gets destroyed is meant to get destroyed. And that's what I mean by theater. What gets through, basically, if a ship gets through, if the Iron Dome, basically anything gets through, is because it's meant to get through based upon the factions of power that control what actually happens here. And there is an escalation ladder, and it is a controlled escalation ladder. It goes tick for tack. It doesn't lead to absolute chaos. You don't get the, massive shock and awe campaign that we got during Iraq. And you get basically wild cards, which are the factions of power that need to be eliminated. What do those factions of power do? They try and derail the agreed outcome. And so basically, this is the mechanisms that we're witnessing right now. So I want to go through what we saw over the last 6 days, and what makes me still believe, despite everybody violently opposing me, getting incredibly upset, making me think that I'm a propagandist or whatever. I've been on Spaces 24/7, or well, not 24/7. I've done the 12-hour shift to try and make sure that I'm up to date with what's actually happening here, and all sides of the propaganda. So the major signal for me that this is still theatrical, and by theatrical means agreed outcome with wild cards where things can go wrong to try and derail the process. The US is basically simultaneously bombing Iran while basically ensuring the Gulf and the Strait, the Gulf shipping routes via the Strait of Hormuz. And so we entered into this US insurance guarantee while simultaneously bombing Iran. Then we had prepared, naval tanker escorts that are allegedly right now letting US ships through. Whether it gets through or whether that turns into a naval operation where they fight back and forth, I believe that would have been agreed. But there will be factions of power within the military-industrial complex that might be trying to derail. And so that is, a complete, you wouldn't get guarantees. You wouldn't get naval guarantees, insurance, which is controlled by the financial industrial complex, that did what they've never done before. They started insuring these shipments for 75% of tank value. That didn't happen in the Red Sea. That didn't happen in the Suez Canal. There was a high insurance premium, and one could say this is unprecedented, but 75% means the insurers are shutting down. Now, prior to this war, a lot of those contracts, those insurance contracts, basically had a force majeure agreement that would allow for those for the cancellation of those agreements within a very short period of time. Either that was preparation for the war, or they are actually the ones that are able to, the faction of power within Iran, with the financial industrial complex, are able to close the Strait of Hormuz via these insurance contracts. And so, we are witnessing what that is right now. And next week, I'll cover more updates based upon what actually happens. What other policies do we see? Well, we saw the US Department of Finance, which would be aligned with the FIC, and the corporation that does that, they set these insurance and they effectively shut the Strait of Hormuz. You had the Oman agreement that agreed peace talks are going well. You then had the US operation on Saturday that was, against what the progress that was announced from Oman, despite Iran saying that they will agree to zero nuclear enrichment and the framework had been set. Then you had the agreement within Iran parliament, the reformists, to agree to a parliament vote to allow the Strait of Hormuz to be closed. Then you got announcements from factions of power within the IRGC that it has been enforced, and anybody that goes past will be targeted. Then you had, at the very same time, the insurance companies that said, we're going to put a 75% premium. And once the insurers said it's not cost effective, effectively the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Oil price went up significantly. And then as soon as the US Navy said that they're going to start escorting the operations, we had a correction in the oil price. And then leading up to whether it's going to get through or not get through, right now, as we witness in live time, before this broadcast, I looked, the price of oil was at all-time recent highs of $92. During the Iraq war, during the pandemic, you had highs of about $125, $130. And then after the operations, it went down to a low of $35. Now, prior to this, we had $60. It went up to about $80. It corrected back down. And now it's up to $92. We're hitting the $100 mark, which will all be based upon this experiment of what happens with the Strait of Hormuz. What was the market reaction? Basically, we had stocks that initially went down, not too drastically, and then they all recovered. We had massive issues within the South Korean market, down 12%. The circuit breakers kicked in, then it went up 10%, and now it's come back a little bit more. And so this is not implying that they believe that this Strait of Hormuz is going to be closed long time based upon real capital. We had bond yields going up in the US, so not much, but slightly up. So this means the cost of the US refinancing its debt is going to be more expensive based upon the longer 10-year and 20 and 30-year treasuries. Oil prices fell, and then they bounced back, and now they're at the all-time highs as well. But the interpretation is effectively that the Strait of Hormuz disruption has been a known entity, and there is an expiry, and certain factions of power know when that expiry is going to be. We don't know when it is, but there are factions of power that I believe, know exactly when that Strait of Hormuz is going to be opened. And so basically, I think this is bounded escalation by the financial industrial complex. And that is designed to get a reaction from the military industrial complex that is got bounded escalations, but there are factions of power that may be breaking on those agreements. Now, we had Israel targeted significantly. But what were those targets? It was like the 12-day war so far as well. Now, it's a fog of war. We don't know the exact targets. You can't tell what's true, what's not true. But so far, what has been targeted in Israel? Well, we've seen that Iran has taken out Israeli command centers and basically Israeli missile sites as well. We've seen that they have taken out air bases. And we've seen on the Iran side that IRGC infrastructure has been taken out as well. Now, what we might have seen is a series of false flags from the military industrial complex, the MIC, and some of those might be, like, for example, within Iran, we tragically had a targeting of a school in Iran, which allegedly is next to a military base, but that led to the death, sadly, of over 100 school kids aged between 6 and 12 in Iran. That could have been a false flag, but that's very much like an Israeli operation that we saw in Gaza when they eliminated all these different children infrastructures, hospitals, and everything else. Took out all the hospitals, took out all the infrastructure. Now, that might be a wild card. I don't believe that that's negotiated or agreed in any way, shape, or form. And so, therefore, that might be a faction of power that did that. There was allegations that it's US as well. We don't know what's true right now, but we can only work with what we got. So that implies to me that there are some kind of wild cards. Also, I believe that Saudi Arabia was meant to be the offboarding, the one that was brokering the peace. And so the fact that some of its oil fields and Qatar gas fields and gas tankers got targeted, they could either be wild cards or a part of the plan. I'll explain both arguments as well. But we had the Iran retaliation. And so what was the Iran retaliation? Well, it was going after the Gulf, not countries, the Gulf US bases, the Gulf that look like they were evacuated in advance as well. Now, that could be evacuated because they knew it was coming, or evacuated because it was agreed and it was meant to happen as well. And so missiles were fired towards Israel. Damage has been largely contained. And the GCC have basically, they've taken an economic hit, no doubt about it, but they've had their US bases eliminated. And this allows them to renegotiate all their contracts and show some autonomy. And so far, we have seen that autonomy. I'll go through what happened yesterday. But effectively, I believe we're watching some kind of energy theater right now. Because what's happening? We're getting announcements from all the world leaders saying, I'll help here, I'll help there. And we know the countries are the most exposed. And this is the purpose of closing the Strait of Hormuz and the targets. I think it's all strategic in terms of the multipolar world order and splitting the world up into blocks. So far, we had Iran drones that striked the Ras Laffan LNG facility in Qatar. And that's what really spiked the LNG prices. The impact was that the world's largest LNG exporter in the world and the hub was disrupted. We're talking 20% of all LNG. Now, who did that impact the hardest? Let's look through. Well, of course, what was the reaction in the market? The European gas prices spiked insanely. We had an instant 50% increase in TTL, which is the index for all the gas prices across Europe. Then we had secondary effects as well. What is the secondary effect? Well, remember, during the Russia-Ukraine war, the dependency upon LNG from Russia, the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, and we had the sanctions. And while there are still LNG getting through from Russia, they started to reduce that significantly and they started to hedge. Where did Europe hedge? They hedged with Qatar and they hedged with the US. And so if Qatar is down and US relationships have been set up and there's sanctions on Russia, where is Europe going to go? They're going to have to renegotiate with the US. What was the Europe-US trade deal? $750 million of energy transactions. That could not be fulfilled at the time because of Qatar, because of Russia. Now, Europe has to negotiate from a point of weakness, and US can set whatever terms they want. So US LNG becomes the safest supply route for Europe. A trade negotiation, impact on the euro-dollar market, and effectively vassalization of Europe into the financial industrial complex, which is hosted within America. Now, Saudi had already built alternative pipelines across the Middle East, which is containing the price of oil right now. If it wasn't for these US supplies, if it wasn't for these Saudi supplies as well, and these alternative pipelines, then immediately we probably would have had oil above $100 or up to $150. Saudi looks great. Saudi had prepared for this. The Iranian leadership delegation has basically, had these basically strikes that decapitate part of some of the hardliners. And so we saw the elimination of Khamenei. Now, I don't know whether that was negotiated with the lower levels of Iranian reformists and less hardline IRGC, whether it was agreed by Khamenei himself, or whether it was a wild card faction of the military-industrial complex. But the response to that was to prevent any kind of external regime change. This was a rally around the flag effect within Iran. This is an extreme position. This pushes the IRGC hardliners to fight harder. Once you have that response and you have that narrative, it helps the US to say, we eliminated. It gives the offboarding narrative to both US and Israel, and it gets the rally around the flag effect, and it gets the IRGC hardliners potentially pushing harder, and it gets the next layer of leaders that are going to effectively be part of the continuation plan after what I think will be the off ramps. Now, who was around that table and who survived? Well, we had the taking out of the Grand Leader Khomeini. We had the defense minister taken out. We had IRGC commanders taken out. We had the chief of staff taken out. We had national security secretary taken out. But what didn't we have taken out? We didn't have the family member, Mohabaga Khomeini, survived. Is that meant to be the continuation plan? Possible, integrations. And we had the continuity, basically candidates seem to be protected. We will know afterwards. Is that effectively the old guard being removed and the new guard being a part of the negotiations? Is this a topple-down strategy until eventually you have the hardliner retaliations that are remaining on script? And so this could be, those that are left alive are the ones that are going to usher in the new world order, the alignment with China, the alignment with the Gulf countries, and the alignment with the financial industrial complex to open up the markets as we get sanction removal and the opening up. So we had Przezkean, which is the elected leader of the Reform Party. I think it's called a prime minister. Sorry if I'm getting this wrong. We had Aragachi, which is the IRGC members we talked about earlier. We had Larijani, and we had basically, I believe, Iran doing their own regime change. And that's being done alongside negotiations in order to transition to this world aligned with the GCC and BRICS. And so basically, aligned with that, you need the proxy network wind down. I believe Iran has stopped supporting various militias. I believe US has stopped supporting. I believe Israel has stopped supporting. And we're entering into all of these agreements that we've been covering over the weeks, where you have the wind down in Syria, various other factions. And when states start sponsoring, suddenly the ideology phases out because war's a racket and they always work for someone. And that someone is whoever's providing the capital weapons and choke points. So we had escalations with Lebanon. That was the next thing. Hezbollah came out with some rockets, said in reaction to Khomeini. That created the justification for Israel to come in harder via airstrike dominance. And we entered into a political process within Lebanon. And so, there were those, even though we had a peace agreement, there was a continual operations with Israel. And so the Hezbollah's military, the military arm was basically declared illegal within the Lebanese government. And so they were told that there will be a weapons confiscation and it has to begin. And we also had escalations basically greater than the initial response. And so I believe those are decapitation campaigns, and there will be a political process with Hezbollah that leads to integration or elimination as well within the Lebanese infrastructure. We also had threats of militia groups coming into the Iran border. That was the Kurdish forces. Remember last week we interviewed Amir Taki. We were saying that the Kurds have often been funded by the US factions of power and US Department of Defense, and they were guarding the oil in Israel, in Syria, and they had factions of power within Turkey, within Syria, within Iran, and there was a covert operation by Western powers to destabilize the region called creating a new state called Kurdistan. Just like you have the Greater Israel Project PSYOP, you have the Kurdistan PSYOP, you have the Greater Iran PSYOP, and you have NATO expansion PSYOP. And all the time you're playing these divide and conquer and these different things. Well, the Kurdish forces were basically said that they're going to do a coordinated campaign, and Trump was talking about them going in, and there was different types of operations that were speculated upon. We don't know what's going to happen, But really, if you think about it, there's only about 10,000 Kurds in that operation, and there's a population of 90 million within Iran, and the IRGC is diversified across a vast, mountainous Iran. So impossible. The only thing it could do is it could take some kind of limited operation where maybe it's meant to come after some special IRGC forces within the Kurdish region. And maybe it's meant to, prevent some kind of redeployment, but it feels like a limited operation. It's not going to lead to what we're being told in the propaganda outlets like PBD that's saying we're going to have, the Shah returned, and the Shah's son is going to return, and the Iranian people are going to uprise, and they're going to overthrow the Islamist regime, and they're going to have everything that they wanted, and America is the savior trying to save the Iranian people. No, this is all about resources, and they're all paid shills or useful idiots from the Iranian diaspora, which hate the government and so went to live in America. And they are, essentially useful idiots to point a narrative that effectively created Operation Ajax 2.0 that we covered a couple of weeks ago, where I said, you had an uprising against a militarized IRGC, which is obviously going to lead to a reaction. You had then Scott Bessent say that he created a currency war. And then you had Lindsey Graham and Peter Huckabee, or whatever it is, admitting that Mossad were in those operations as well. And then you had the whole narrative of 50,000 people have been killed, all the BS and the propaganda. So regional players are effectively, holding back here. And so why are they holding back? And why does it feel like a tit for tat? And why is it not, the shock and awe campaign that you normally need? Well, we had a series of announcements as well, which is what the real thing is about. We had announcements from Putin that came out and said, as a result of all this increase in oil price, as a result of the Strait of Hormuz being shut down, as a result of the oil tankers and LNG tankers and ports, Qatar says it's shutting down production. That resets the world order. We're going to be dealing with this for months to come. Serious consequences, particularly for Europe and various other factions. We'll go through that. But Russia said that it will come along and it can help anybody that has oil issues, or if they want to sign any LNG deals. That creates an alignment with Russia. The higher the price of oil, the more they can sell that oil and fund the Ukraine operation as well and help that operation. China immediately came out and said they put out an immediate ceasefire call. They want Iran. They basically warned Iran against hitting some of the Gulf energy infrastructure. The GCC, they basically came out, and as their bases, their US bases were being stricken, whatever it is. They came out with just diplomatic statements. There was no, it was all like, we have the right to defend. It was, we condemn. It was, we need to move to de-escalation. We reserve the right, all those types of things. But there was no military participation from the Gulf countries so far. Almost like they wanted their US bases to be hit. Almost like that helped them renegotiate certain contracts with Russia, China, and factions of the military-industrial complex in favor of a plan with the financial-industrial complex and the technical-industrial complex. So the regional powers are not escalating so far. If there are any wild cards in that, I'll correct my analysis. But so far, I think that's been very much part of a plan. And I'm sorry if you think, I went back earlier around theatrics and defining it if you've come in early. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is basically reality. This changes everything. This is the global reset. Now, Iran did not, Iran did not physically close the strait as we covered earlier. It just said that the parliament said we can, and then IRGC said we are closing it, and then they said the naval will be enforcing it. Now, where did the closure actually come from? It came from the insurance companies, the financial industrial complex. Now, people were arguing with me whether it's, one leading the other, and I cover more about that in the debate in part 2. But effectively, it was the highest war risk premiums, significantly higher. And also, it was based upon European contracts and force majeure contracts that were put up before this. The results were that the tankers all halted. And that effectively changed everything. Serious consequences that we're going to be dealing with for a long time. Immediately, there was a shipping backlog outside the Hormuz. Financial infrastructure was effectively, closed it. And this is the insurance companies. We had the US basically saying that they've now sanctioned some gas tanker ships to go through. We've said that that's happening, whether it's happening or not, but that really determines the price of oil went up $92. US said that they would underwrite and guarantee it. They would say they would do naval escorts. That's a significant cost to the US taxpayer. And obviously, a shit ton of money to be made by the financial industrial complex, the insurers, and the military industrial complex that gets that money through doing the escorting and stuff like that. That created the European energy shock, which has absolutely wrecked energy prices in Europe. Europe basically had to negotiate. We don't have Russia. We don't have Qatar LNG anymore. But now we got US. So you have a dependency, which is for the Western Hemisphere. You had, remember what I said? I always said the MIC will eventually make up for war in Europe and in the in the Central and South America, and internal civil unrest within America as it becomes a regional power rather than global power. I think we're still moving towards that. Now, Qatar basically has a major impact. It's a hit on their economy, no doubt about it. But the Lastian, distribution, they basically said we're closing production. So once they reopen again, we can return to normal energy infrastructure. That means that US gets to renegotiate all their different terms as the energy exporter, and that will be in line with the multipolarity, I believe, set by the financial industrial complex. As we said, TTL, the index for European gas, jumped about 50%. And the financial impact is that it put pressure on the euro-dollar system. Remember, now we had the strengthening of the dollar throughout this. So DXY, which was going down to a low of about $96, is now up to about a high of $99. And so we had a bit of a strengthening of the dollar. I think once we get to the other side, we'll go back to the dollar weakening campaign again. But effectively, Qatar is able to have significant influence over the euro dollar. That's one of the implications, as well as the petrodollar. Now, what else relies upon the Strait of Hormuz? The artificial intelligence supply chain. That's a major vulnerability because it impacted South Korean market immediately, because we had a market crash because South Korea relies upon the Strait of Hormuz for both its energy and being able to do its strategic, semiconductor chip supply chains as well. Then we had a recovery, and that recovery was based upon US announcements. That US announcement was based upon financial industrial complex guarantees. So then we had a reaction, and then we have that right now because Samsung and SK Hynix, they basically dominate AI memory chips. Now, those supply chains can only go around Asia and via some of these dependency upon the Strait of Hormuz in Iran. So basically, the production requirement has been impacted, all of the energy as well. Who else relies upon getting energy from the Strait of Hormuz? Japan. So now Japan was immediately vulnerable. It didn't crash. The markets didn't crash as much as South Korea because the Japanese stock market is very internal. But they have heavy energy imports, and they rely upon it. So this is a disaster for Japan. It had a correction. It has, the market volatility all in between. But this can create systemic risk because remember, we have the Japan carry trade. We recently had the Bank of Japan that was raising their rates in order to, which breaks the hedge funds that are able to borrow at 0% from the Bank of Japan. And then you had the rate calls between the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and the Bank of Japan, and some strategic action there. But immediately you had the strengthening of the current, the dollar, and the weakening as well. And this is problematic for the Japan carry trade disruption as well. But by controlling oil, you have a control mechanism for the Japan carry trade. And this really impacts the AI bench. Basically, everything is about these AI supply chains and these energy supply chains. That led to the DXY strengthening to about $99. And effectively, where escalation could break, we could have, these controls of these different supply chains and routes. This is how you reset the world order. This is how you push everything to multipolarity. It's got nothing to do with America going to war with Iran and regime change and the cartoon factions that you actually, have been fed. So who are basically the supplier factions that are able to reopen this? Well, you've got the IRGC hardliners. And now you've got the people that can disrupt this, basically the antagonists. So the IRG hardliners might be putting out wild cards. They could do things that are off plan. You also might have the Israeli MIC factions that are looking to make some more profits by prolonging this war against the plan of the finance side. You could also have US MIC interests as well that are used to US dominance, and they're pulling their political strings and they're fighting against this. So these are all the different wild cards that can happen. But effectively, by having this negotiation between the FIC and the MIC, war functions as a sorting mechanism in order to determine who to take out, who's not on board with the FIC plan. Those are the MIC-aligned factions of power. Those are the ones within Israel that need to be regime changed. Those are the ones within US that are the antagonists that need to be regime changed. Those are the ones within IRGC that either needs to be decapitated or they're a part of the integration. So by pushing out all of the wild cards, you get to know who to target and who's not on board the plan, I think, is what's happening right now as a military wargaming as well. This determines basically who's willing to integrate, who needs to be eliminated, and this includes militia groups as well, proxies, as well as the groups of power and the factions that we've talked about. This is effectively Gulf financial leverage and the financial industrial complex factions. Now, what happened yesterday? Well, immediately there was an announcement made in the Financial Times. So rather than the Gulf countries retaliating, conveniently they have their US bases eliminated. We got an announcement from the Financial Times. Now, remember what I've said, media is always propaganda. It's not independent journalism. It is what do powerful forces, when you see in the FT or you see an article saying, my anonymous source says, that anonymous source could be CIA, it could be Mossad, it could be MI6, it could be, FIC aligned, MIC aligned, but that's what media is. There's no independent media. You follow the money and you can see that the FT has always been a mouthpiece for the financial industrial complex. Remember what I said, the FIC is aligned with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, with China and with the reformist factions of Iran, which is the opposite of the military industrial complex. So what did the FT say? Well, the FT said that the GCC are reviewing hundreds of billions of dollars in US investment. We don't hear anything from Trump on this. Remember, Trump has always been bragging as part of his, his midterm election and, his kind of campaigns. We got $18 trillion of inbound investment. That's the Gulf. That's some US, technical industrial complex investments. in data centers and the Gulf countries as well. And so they're going to be revising those investments. Now, what are those investments? This is all the major funds. Which funds? You got the PIF, which is the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. You got ADIA, which is the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund. You got QIA, which is the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund. You got KIA, which is the Kuwaiti Sovereign Wealth Fund. And you've got Capital that is basically supporting the investment in the US into what? Infrastructure, data centers, private credit that is building out all the AI data centers. Basically, all of the things that are needed for the AI data centers. Also, what else were they agreeing to invest in? Defense agreements. So now they're going to be able to renegotiate all those defense agreements, and they're going to be able to pull leverage on those AI investments. This means that the market was dependent upon that. What was the immediate reaction? Bitcoin was up 5% and it came down 3%. The markets today crashed in general a little bit. I'm not sure in real time, but the markets corrected, and AI stocks and have implications as well. So this puts pressure on US markets and potential pressure on petrodollar weakening campaign. Now, immediately, Saudi has been selling off their US treasuries and buying US equities instead. That's part of the asset stripping mechanism that allows these Gulf sovereign wealth funds to have their say in US foreign policy as well. Now, they, as a result of this, can do a military realignment. What are they going to be doing? We talked about Anthropic earlier. Anthropic is involved in creating a narrative to work that's very friendly to non-US AI military infrastructure. Maybe that's part of it. But what would the market signal? Bitcoin fell. Immediately that marks, because it was out of market. AI stocks came down, and that's what we saw in the futures market. But that was down with the market in general as well. Now, this can transition to a multipolar security shift. No longer US bases. What does it tell the world? It tells the world that if you have a US base in your country, it was meant to protect you from foreign attacks. It didn't protect from foreign attacks, and there was no retaliation. So that tells the world if you have a US base, it doesn't protect you. And so what is that US base for? Well, it should shift to a multipolar infrastructure, renegotiations with BRICS, India, China, Russia. And the Gulf countries, I believe, will all diversify. And as part of a normalization agreement, in order to control Israel not being a part of the MIC, that can be part of the integration of Israel into GCC infrastructure as well. So Gulf is basically able to hedge their alliances right now. That marks the end of the petrodollar and the managed transition of the weakening of the petrodollar based upon new relationships with China, Russia, India. India then was already frantically doing new negotiations with Israel. We had that very theatrical thing. And leading up to this, UAE as well. Those are going to be the purchasers of Israeli military industrial complex infrastructure. And that will be part of the negotiation. This will be the emerging multipolar security architecture that I believe will come at the end of this. Now, we also had agreements leading up to this between unprecedented agreements between Saudi Arabia, between Turkey and Pakistan. Pakistan, a nuclear power. Turkey, a very militarized company aligned with NATO. Potential of bringing in Egypt. So what happened with Turkey? We had a bit of a Turkey factor. So Turkey has a strategic position in the world. It's got NATO bases, effectively aligned with US and Europe. It had a migration buffer for Europe. So there's the EU connection, the US connection. It was an energy corridor for Russia as well. It's an important trade corridor for China. And what did we have here? We had Iran struck many of the US bases across the GCC and the Gulf region. But with Turkey, it was the only one that, from my understanding, was intercepted. And so Turkey basically avoided the direct hits, but was targeted to show that it has force over disruption, all of those supply chains. But the missiles were all intercepted when it came to Turkey before they made impact. The interpretation of this is that Turkey is basically positioned to be a neutral, and untouchable force when we get the off-ramps. Also, Saudi, it may have been targeted through false flag operations or through genuine Iranian targeting. But we have, I believe, Saudi not retaliating provide the narrative for a Saudi off-ramps as well. Potential false flag from Israel, which may have been misaligned factions trying to do that. But also Oman. Oman was the peace negotiator that was making all the strategic announcements saying the off-ramps still exist. So in the end state, I believe you get Saudi looking like the one that was able to suppress the price of oil through their alternative routes, push this into diplomacy. And they said next Sunday, they're all going to be meeting, I think it said at Egypt, in order to push forward. And I believe that is continuation of negotiations. And the negotiations hadn't stopped. What we're witnessing right now was part of the negotiations and part of the agreed outcomes that we're currently witnessing. What is the end state going to be? In my prediction, I could be wrong, but this is what I think we're going to be seeing as a result of this. I think we have an incentive towards negotiation settlement and an off-ramps. What is going to be in that negotiated settlement? Well, it's going to lead us towards the final war and regional stability and the final basically taking over of all proxies for real state military. It's going to lead to the economic integration, and it's going to be the expected outcomes, I believe, is going to be as follows. We will end up with a normalized Iran without an external regime change, with the IRG infrastructure being preserved that is aligned with the reformist elements of the government, aligned with BRICS and aligned with the GCC. We're going to have a GCC-led regional security architecture, which will work across the Levant. It will work in Palestine, and it will, with the optics of Israel preserving some of its narrative, integrated into that GCC infrastructure. We will have a significantly weakened basically de-weaponized and constrained Israel, because they would have fired everything that they've got. That gives leverage to the FIC over the MIC. And I think the MIC has agreed to that already. In the long term, we'll get an integration, and that integration will be between India and UAE purchasing strategic assets from Israel, so that it is enforced into a new model that does not involve being an agitator for MIC and the Greater Israel Project. It will be integration into GCC, and it will be a pathway towards the Palestinian border security and architecture. And that will be set with Trump being able to look like he's the peace guy. And so the border peace takes the off-ramps narrative that has already been agreed via the China process and all of these different strategic agreements. You get to implement it by saying it was done via the border peace. And the border peace will have the technical industrial complex, surveillance and police state mechanism, and the negotiations between who actually hosts the data. We will have, via this operation this week, and we've already had it, a global commodity stress test. We'll have the Strait of Hormuz functioning as basically a global economic experiment. And we're going to be seeing what the market reaction is, are being tested all simultaneously. What markets? Crude oil, different types of refined fuels, liquefied natural gas, LNG, NGLs, fertilizers. The fertilizers were significantly important to India. Methanol, different economies that would depend upon methanol, different types of petrochemical derivatives that need petrol and chemical exports via the Strait of Hormuz, semiconductor chips in terms of the South Korea stuff, strategic minerals, silver, gold. And basically, we're seeing the real impact of these global markets in real time. And that creates leverage for US. But what's US? US is controlled by the financial industrial complex. So this is private banking interest using the US and the US military as a paid for rent militia to renegotiate with BRICS and the GCC and ASEAN and SEO in the different power blocks so that they can transition the world into a multipolar world order. And then they'll be using US pensions, US insurance contributions, endowment funds through BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard in order to push the ETF framework that will push capital into the countries where they've got their strategic positions and allowing currencies to outperform the dollar, allowing foreign markets to outperform the US stock market, asset strip the US, turn it into a regional hegemon, and remove slowly a managed transition from the dollar using the petrodollar, the euro dollar, the Japan carry trade, silver, commodities, and these different routes. And an example of it is right, like we've been talking about in the past. Obviously, the financial industrial complex has been able to penetrate India as the weakest link within BRICS. Why? Now, if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, India, 25% of the fertilizer imports are via the Strait of Hormuz. That destroys an industry that was already being negotiated between US and India. Also, a double whammy. They get gas shortages in their distributions of this fertilizers and the production process. That is disaster for India. What about Bangladesh? Bangladesh has started cutting their power supply. They have LNG shortages, and they are severely impacted. Those will be part of the supply chain in order to negotiate FIC integration with ASEAN character after tariffs had turned those exporters into distressed assets. After American small to medium-sized business via tariffs became distressed assets. Now, they may be suing back to get their money back, but they may go bankrupt in the process. So the banks have been doing record M&A. Now, Egypt and Jordan, they were dependent upon Israel gas imports. Now, if you shut down those Indian gas imports, Jordan and Egypt need to find new plans involved into the Gulf version of the region, and Israel loses that money. This depletes away Israel's $230 billion in reserves. This is costing them $3 billion a week. Their tourism industry is zero. Their population is decreasing. They had to manipulate their balance sheet to make it look stronger. Their stock market is going up because of the MIC. So private interests are taking over the real economy. So Israel is being burdened with higher debt. Their debt ratings are going up in terms of the cost of their refinancing. That means they're subordinate to bondholders, FIC. They're subordinate to equity holders, FIC. And they can be pushed into ETF flows that is partnership with the faction of BRICS that FIC is trying to penetrate the most, India and also UAE. That's how the FIC resets the world order and starts redistributing these flows in this post-dollar hegemony world. Now, the supplies of 20% of global LNG goes via the Qatar plant that is now shut from production. The result is that we had severe distress in both Europe and Asia, and they're going to be competing for different types of cargo shipments, renegotiations. Countries are going to be seeking alternative supplies. This is not factored into the price yet. It seems to be that it believes that these will be resolved fairly soon, as if those negotiations had already been agreed up front. Where are those different types of negotiations going to come from? US, which represents private FIC interest, Australia, private FIC interest, and Africa, which also presents a bridge between the Belt and Road Initiative, the sovereign wealth funds, the North African routes that basically UAE, Saudi, Turkey have been have been negotiating leading up to this, and then all of the strategic reconstruction types of exports that are needed. So effectively, the Strait of Hormuz has kind of represented a central global commodity system, and it is being stretched and tested and reset into a multipolar world order. Once this experiment ends, which I believe, and I'll correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we're still headed to a similar length to the 12-day war. I don't see how this remains without being turning, I don't think the goal is to create a global financial crisis. I don't think the goal is to escalate to World War III. In fact, this is alternative to that in order to reset the world order into multipolarity, so you don't have to have World War III or global financial crisis. We'll see how much they succeed at it. But the faster it ends, the more likely the FIC plan is to go. The longer this goes on for, the more likely that Mick is pushing additional leverage in order to hold on for additional power, given that it is going to be weakened in power as this progresses. So the Strait, when it reopens, you'll have shipping routes normalization. You'll have eventually market stabilization. You'll have winners and losers. But effectively, the system has already been reshaped right now, even if it opens today. It's been reshaped already. We're not entering back into the old world order. This is the global reset. This is the definition of the multipolar world order. And this is the AI and surveillance state that we're going to eventually transition to, which will be a global trend. That's exactly what we have seen during week one. So I maintain my belief that this is a managed transition, that this is theatrical, but this is way more dramatical than I ever imagined. And there are certainly factions of power, but the real war is not what we're seeing. It is not a war between Iran, US, and Israel. That's the narrative. This is the financial industrial complex and the military industrial complex. Go back to the beginning if you just tuned in. And the factions of power within transnational capital and transnational military that are effectively resetting that world order and determining if you're not on board with this plan, you are eliminated, and then you will be integrated if you still survive as well. So that's what I think is happening. Now, what I wanted to do is provide somebody that I respect in terms of their work that completely disagrees with me. And I'm going to play in part 2 a space that I was on this week where I was giving an update on the financial markets and the different impacts on the different markets in real time. And Ryan Dawson, who I respect for his work, came up and really, really aggressively disagreed with me. And it was really around who actually controls the world and our understanding of it. So we entered into a debate, and I'm going to play that debate right now. And I would like you in the comment section to tell me, is Ryan right or am I right? And I've provided my analysis for what I think. What we found out is I think people don't change their mind much. Those that believe Israel rule the world would agree with Ryan. Those that believe Israel is a strategic tool for the military-industrial complex and that this is really a managed transition and Israel propped up the dollar by wartime profiteering and Mick, then they may be aligned more with me. What I would say in terms of who Ryan Dawson is before we head over to the video. So Azad's going to play it in a bit. He'll get that ready. But on my blog on SimonDixon.com, you'll see various documentaries where I've referred to Ryan's work. If you go into my blog and you see there was a blog from 9/11 to the White House, in there is a 4-hour documentary on who did 9/11 and the declassified documents and everything to understand that was an inside job and a false flag involving Mossad CIA and Saudi intelligence. That was Ryan Dawson's work. He's been at this for like 19 years. Also, when I have a blog, for example, is Trump blackmailed? Ryan Dawson's work is referenced in terms of, the Charles Kushner, Roy Cohn, Epstein blackmail operations that happened. That was, I refer to his blogs there. Also, the blog on JFK and the new mech, how Israel stole the bomb. That was using also some of Ryan Dawson's work. So I respect his work, but we have a different analysis in terms of who's on top of the chain and the financial flows. And this really represents a prevailing narrative. I also did a debate with Professor Zhang, who is getting a lot of attention right now for his predictions. And you can go to my blog or you can go to my YouTube and you can see the debate between me and Professor Zhang, where he believes that effectively we're moving to a world that's dominated by Israel and Pax Judaica. And I said we're moving to a world that is dominated by transnational capital, and the Middle East and the financial industrial complex will win out. You can see that debate. So what I want you to do is have people that disagree with me so that you can have your own critical thinking, because I'm sharing my predictions. And so we're going to play a competing, explanation. Now, Ryan can be a bit colorful with language, and he can be a bit aggressive. That's just his style. But, it was still a friendly debate that got very heated. And so Ryan's thesis is that effectively Israel controls US policy and Zionism as an ideology is what's driving everything. And the war is effectively, this is a genuine power conflict. There's no orchestration. And either Iran wins or Israel wins. And if Israel wins, we will enter into a world where Pax Judaica is in a battle versus anti-Zionist Iran. And this is a real battle, an ideological battle. And whoever wins this is being fought over ideology. And so what I'd like for you to make is, I'd like you as the audience to make a decision. Which framework do you think explains all of these events? I've given you my explanation in part 1. And now I'd like you to take that framework and compare it to Ryan Dawson's framework. And if you'd like to go over to some of my other videos, you can see Professor Zhang's framework as well. Because I only care about accuracy, not being right, so that I can help you make decisions and understand how the world really works. And then once you know how the world works, it's easier to build a plan based upon knowing the rules rather than based upon deception. So with that in mind, that was my full-blown analysis. Now, what I'll be doing is if anyone wants to give shorter versions to people, please do share this content. If people like the details like me and you, please do share this content if you're still with me, with anyone else that likes the details. But also, we'll publish on my blog and on my YouTube channel, and on my X, and on Rumble as well, and on my podcast, on both Apple and Spotify, and basically AI version condensed down for people that need shorter whiteboard videos, or they need a like a 10-minute AI summary, or you can share this actual long version, and we put it all onto my blog. I've done that for all of the previous episodes where we were sharing this framework of me saying it would weaken Israel, weaken Iran, and weaken US bases. That was on the Gold blog, and all the different subjects and where I follow the money. All of those are on SimonDixon.com. And if you register there, you can get a newsletter. I won't sell you anything. No sponsorship, no monetization, no adverts, no business agenda. I'm not here to sell you anything. I just want to share information so that you can understand how the world works from my perspective. And I also want to share with you competing perspectives. So without further ado, we're now going to go into part 2 of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. And we're going to be answering the question through a debate on X Spaces that answers the question, does Israel really control US foreign policy? And this is from my analysis, a debate between Ryan Dawson and myself. And I'm now going to play that for you And you can decide and let me know in the comments section once you've said this, is Ryan right? Has he got the right framework? Or am I right? Have I got the right framework? I'm really curious what you have to say. So please do at the end of this also like, share, comment, and we're going to hand over to that space, and I'll be seeing you this time next week.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Let me give some market updates. Okay. So they're very, very exposed. So some of the LNG production ending in Qatar and the Strait of Hormuz closure is very, very catastrophic for several regions if this continues. So the ones that are most impacted is Japan, South Korea. China is completely hedged short term, but if this actually went on for months, this would become a major issue for China. And Europe is in a state of disaster as a result of this. So obviously, they, as a result of the Ukrainian war, they were hedging away from their Russian Russian imports. They still maintained some of the trade with Russia while pushing sanctions, and then at the same time, were trying to engage in escalating war. That's game set match for Putin. Putin and America basically can continue the war. They can end the war. They can profit from Ukraine. They can carve up Ukraine. They can do whatever they want at this stage, because the U.S. stock market is loving the news of Europe becoming a LNG and dependency upon America. So the stocks of the oil companies, the LNG companies on the US stock market are propping up the market at the moment, as well as defense stocks. So there is definitely an element of profiteering, money printing, and that desire where Trump said, let's get the military budget leading up to this from 1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. He also, if you remember, started to attack those that were doing stock buybacks and executive pays. And so leading up to this, he was kind of signaling, I need you to deal with some of these shortages because there's a shit ton of money to be made from war. The Israeli stock market has done well as a result of that, because these are the two war stock markets. And also it's helping UK, Germany, and France stock market. So all of those are okay. In Asia, South Korea had a 12% crash. That's a major correction. That led to circuit breakers kicking in, which is when the market is crashing too hard. You have to have a circuit breaker to stop people and give a little pause on the economy as well. I got to check out what's happening in UAE because they closed the market for 2 days, and so they should be reopening today. I'll get an update on that. I forgot to actually check that one. But the Asian stock markets, they're not liking this at all. The European and British stock market is just profiteering from war. The American stock market is profiteering from war. But the world is, we've kind of had a resurgence of neutral assets. So gold is kind of between all-time highs, around about that 5,200 to 5,300 mark. At its low, its recent low was just below 5,000. Half of that has been recovered as a result of this resurgence into neutral assets. The Bitcoin looked like the bottom of the market. So from the moment this war started, Bitcoin started recovering from a low of 62,000 and is now approaching 72,000. So there seems to be early signs of a movement towards neutral assets with all of this uncertainty. Asian stock markets are not liking this at all, the countries that are exposed to this, and countries that have a military industrial complex element to it are kind of propping up the market as well as the energy side. But Europe is being fully hook, line, and sinkered into US control. Whoever controls the energy controls the nation and controls the region. And so it used to be a Russia dependent, then it hedged into a Qatar dependent, and now Europe is becoming a US dependent, which kind of plays around that regional hegemon that America seems to be its new role in the world. Now, when the price of oil spiked on the news of the Strait of Hormuz closure, we only got, if you remember, I said that it would probably go up 10 to 15 points because there would already been 11 points leading up to the war from insiders. We've had a correction back down because it was starting to get out of control, but it never went too far above that $80 mark. If you remember the Ukraine war, it went to a peak of about $125. And then Biden had to frantically go and have a meeting with MBS and say, please flood some oil onto the market. He drained all the strategic petroleum reserves because MBS worked with Putin and decided that the relationship with Biden wasn't something he wanted to bail out. And so America then drained all of its strategic petroleum reserves, about 130 million barrels, in order to try and cartel the inflation that resulted. America doesn't have that. So the strategic petroleum reserve is about half. It's increased, but it's half what it was at its peak, before Biden started draining it. And so Trump doesn't have that card. He could only release about 30 million barrels. Venezuela is non-impactful. It will take years of investment until that can make any type of difference. So it makes zero difference in the short term. So the ability to oppress the price of oil short term is in the hands of OPEC and China. But China is going to be, either they know how long this is going to go on for, or they will not release that oil onto the market because they're preparing for an extended war. My indications are, if you look at the statements from China, they've been putting out public statements that they don't want Iran to escalate this beyond what it is right now within the acceptable, confines. We've seen if we get another week of Iran targeting U.S. assets, Israeli assets, and anything further to do with the cartels, any kind of oil and gas production, you'd expect by next week to start seeing capital outflow from the Gulf countries that would need to find a new home. At the moment, I think it's semi-contained, but whether they react or not, whether they retaliate or not, is really going to, kind of determine whether there is a soft landing and an off ramps for everybody. The problem is if this is genuinely an environment for long-term war, then in essence, in the war between America and China, China would be way more affected by a long-term war, and America would benefit more from a long-term war. In the short term, China wins this if America finds an off-ramps and capitulates. And because all of the military bases across the Gulf countries have been, depending on the level of impact, because we're in the fog of war, we don't know, the extent to it. You would expect that those won't be rebuilt in the fashion that they were built before with full US dependency. You'd imagine that there would be some level of hedging, and those military bases either will never be rebuilt or there will be negotiated new technology. And so with all the AI stuff that's happening right now, you imagine that the Gulf countries are going to have to be choosing between American data, American AI, Chinese data, Chinese AI. And so they're really in a position of how do they rebuild this and how does that set the relationship between the China and America trade war at the moment. So all this to say, the price of oil came back down today. The trigger for that was when Trump announced that he demanded the syndicate of insurers. Now, here's what's really interesting. We were debating throughout the last few days, what would shutting down the Strait of Hormuz look like? We found out that it's just an announcement, but what's really interesting is it was actually the insurers, the banksters, that actually did the blockade. So there is a level of coordination or leverage or vested interest where rather than doing what historically the insurers have done, they literally made it where nobody could ship just through charging like 75% of value. So, the value of what's being shipped, which is basically the same as shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. So what's interesting is Iran announced it, but it was the bankers and the insurance companies that enforced it. And so what does that actually mean? So Trump retaliated in what could have been a coordinated, could have been profiteering from the financial industrial complex, but definitely coordinated. China knew this was happening. The banksters knew this was happening. The oil companies knew this was happening. The Gulf countries leading up to this were actually taking like record levels of oil out of the region. And so you can look at those shipments, and there was a massive spike like weeks prior to this that was very unusual, implying the Gulf countries knew, implying Iran knew, implying China knew, implying America knew as well, because they did the Venezuelan action. So at the very highest levels of oil and financial power, they're 100% prepared, they're profiteering, they're loving it, and it's extraction of wealth from the average people that are not on the right side of these trades. But the oil price reacted very positively and kicked off, positive movement because the US stock market was at that point of inflection. Is it going to gap down? Is it going to gap up? Is it going to be non-impacted? But the announcement from Trump saying that you need to create a new insurance premium and it will be guaranteed by us, as in the US, helping those ships get through, but also guaranteeing the insurance premiums basically by taxpayer money. So there was in a sense a bank bailout through this covert action, not really a bailout because they didn't need a bailout, but more socializing losses and privatizing gains in order to get those shipments through. And the closure, what if that is actually enforceable? This becomes a very interesting thing. If this is going to be a long-term war, you'd expect that US could successfully demonstrate that it can provide those insurance premiums, it can take over, it can guide the shipments through, and it can do that. If it can do that, then you'd expect this to be a war for the banksters, for the military-industrial complex, that the longer it goes on for, the better. If they can't do that, if they can't get those shipments through, then you'd expect the market to react to that accordingly. Because a lot of what's holding up the market right now is the fact that Trump made that announcement and the insurance shipments may or may not get through. So massive volatility. Already, like every different country is looking at, there was a dependency on Egypt, with and Israel has cancelled various purchases. This is going to have a significant impact already if it gets resolved tomorrow for months to come from the fallout of this. I'm expecting Europe will be a really, really hard, will not be able to recover this. It's going to be austerity. It could trigger a recession across UK and Europe. American stock market will be fine. The rich will get richer. The poor will get poorer. There's nothing new there. But that's what the market is telling us right now. And so if we get an off-ramps, a resolution, then officially, I think we've reset the world order, and this was a global reset. If we get an extended war and the US is able to get those shipments through, then this could be, a longer-term geopolitical move of war profiteering that could trigger a global financial crisis and recession similar to 2008 style. That's what I'm seeing in the market so far.
Thanks for that, Simon. I appreciate it. I just want to, the impact that you're covering. When you're talking about like what's likely to happen, I don't know if you, because the different terminologies used, but in Qatar, what was the thing, Brother Ivy, that you read? They've used force majeure as a reason to not, was it produce any more oil? Can you just read what they exactly said?
To cut off production of liquefied natural gas.
Yeah, that implies to me that Qatar is doing something against their own self-interest in order to coordinate with both Iran and Western financial powers and China in trying to coordinate with the banks to try and get a quick resolution here. Force majeure is essentially a clause in the terms and condition that relates to, natural disasters and various other things. But cutting off like production, effectively, if you were wargaming, that is effectively US waging war on Europe. That's what that means, because Europe was 100% dependent upon that Qatar production. And so if they're cutting that off and the banksters are effectively, they were the ones that were responsible for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, it means that there's a coordinated transnational capital operation in order to vassalize Europe deeper and deeper, as they did with the Ukraine and Russian war, into private control, trigger a recession, and create a massive gas dependency of Europe on America.
Sorry, I'm in between working and life and all the things, but did you guys just see that there was a report that came out? 90% of traffic is cratered in the Strait of Hormuz, and they're actually calling, a lot of conservative economists are actually saying that this could surge oil to $100 rather, if they keep it closed for another few days, and that's according to Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, it all depends on whether Trump whether his promise is good and they can get things through. If he can, then you'd expect that to kind of control the price of oil temporarily. If he can't get them through and this continues, then oil is going up and up and up, and it can trigger real ramifications globally.
Simon, if you had to make a call from your analysis, I know we're not trying to force you to go in and look at crystal ball this, but from your experience analysis, what's your call? Is this short term, long term?
Yeah, I think there's a faction of Iran that is on board with a quick off-ramps plan, and there's another faction of Iran in the IRGC that's going all out and is resisting any type of plan that would lead to a short, an off-ramps and a deal. I think it all comes between the two internal factions of reformists and hardliners in Iran, and I think they're on two different paths. And the reason that we're getting decapitation campaigns is to eliminate those that would not be on board of a quick off-ramps versus the IRGC members that are looking to go all out basically turn this into an economic nightmare for the world, basically, in order to enforce a change with. So I think it all comes down to an internal struggle within Iran. That's the decider, and I think China's aligned with the reformist element. The military-industrial complex is aligned with all-out war, and the financial-industrial complex is aligned with the reformist element. So there's an internal struggle, and you can say military is kind of a representation of radical Zionism versus like the BlackRock factions of the world that are trying to reset the world order. That's what the internal struggle is in America. Iran, there's the reformists versus the hardliners. And then in Israel, obviously, they're trying to remain relevant to the military-industrial complex and continue to do warmongering. That's the battle, it's kind of represented by what happens to the proxies on the Iran side, what happens to the hardliners, and then China and America can effectively apply pressure on both Iran and Israel, and then the Gulf countries are kind of. They're either going to retaliate, which means that it hasn't worked, or they're going to do nothing and expect a off-ramps to come through. I'm still favoring short action because long action is a suicide mission. It really is. And we enter into a level of uncertainty that I don't think is factored into the equation right now. So I'm hoping there's going to be a short-term off-ramps.
Maersk announces a temporary suspension of accepting shipping bookings to and from the UAE, Oman, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia until further notice.
Okay, so basically the financial industrial complex is enforcing effectively in reaction to Iran, the blockade. And so they're looking to gain leverage in any negotiations that they might be having in order to open up some of the markets and the oil markets and various other things with reformist factions of Iran is how I interpret that.
I 2000% disagree with all that. Like, they're reacting to a war driven by ideology, and it's not insurance premiums or salesmen that are making some plan to just give the Middle East to China or anything like that. They're reacting because they don't want to lose their goods. Like, of course, insurance goes up when ships could sink to the bottom. That makes sense. And no, Trump can't escort the oil out. There's no grand plan where America and China are just to say, you get that, I got that. America already had it. They're not going to give half their shit away to China. They're losing it because they didn't plan this war well. And Iran is just whooping that ass. That's why they're going to lose it. They're going to lose their footprint in the Middle East. That's happening. China does not want oil and gas to be shut down. Qatar is shutting down its LNG because they can't store it and it's not safe to ship it. It's not some, we're just going to go against our own interests to help the bankers or something. No, they can't. They can't get it out. The strait is closed. So they have to turn it off. It's that simple. They are not producing because they're losing. Saudi Arabia is running out of storage as well because they can't ship it. Iran has raped them in the ass. The news I want to give you, though, is in Qatar, there's evidence that they're using PAC-2s, which means 2000, the year 2000 Patriot 2 systems. They're supposed to be using Patriot 3s, by the way. These things have a interceptor percentage of only about 19%. It's not even a missile-to-missile hit. They just blow up near it and hope the shrapnel hits it. So if they're using PAC-2s, they got to be damn desperate. They are so low on interceptors. They're running out of munitions. I think the U.S.'s target bank is gone. That's why they're bombing police stations and fire stations and trucks and painted decoys on the road. They can't get at these ballistic missiles. A lot of even the Iranian aircraft they can put underground. So they really don't know what off-ramp they have to get out of this mess. They've bitten off more than they can chew. Israel's not doing well in Lebanon. Their tanks are already getting hit and their offense hasn't even really started. Everything's falling apart. And now you've got Trump saying, oh, look, we've got infinite ammo. No, you don't. You don't. And Pete Hegseth saying, oh, just make it go burr, with the factories. And I was explaining that earlier, but there's a lot of new people in the space, so I'll say it again. How utterly stupid what he just said was. It's not a problem with factories. They don't have the supply chains. They don't have the components. They don't have the machine parts. You can't just make more Patriot missiles and cruise missiles. It's not that easy. They're going to lose. Like the only way they got enough firepower to try to get Iran to bend the knee, and they're not going to do it because they're in it to win it. It's an existential threat. Their very existence is at stake. Iran has to stay the course. There's all these rumors saying, "Oh, look, they're about to negotiate." BRICS news. No, they're not. No, that's not happening. They know the U.S. is running out. There was a 4-hour lull today where there were no bombings in Iran. The U.S. and Israel are having to space out their attacks because they're low on munitions and they don't have the ability to replace them. They got outplayed. The U.S. is going to lose its footprint in the Middle East. None of these Gulf Arabs are going to want them back. They weren't protected. All the defense went to save Israel. Their assets weren't protected. They're losing billions of dollars. People are divesting. People are leaving. You've got these campaigns out of Dubai and stuff. You're like, oh, look, it's safe. Invest. Blah, blah, blah. It's over for them. And this wasn't planned out. This is like speculators react. Oh, yeah, oil's going to go up because everyone knew the war with Iran was about to happen. Everybody. They're not causing the war. They're just profiting off it because why not? But this war was created for ideological reasons. The Israelis want to remove Iran so that they can annex territory and ethnically cleanse their neighbors.
Thanks, Ryan. Simon, did you want to respond?
Yeah, well, I was just describing what's happening in the markets and how people, like, the cause and effect is kind of another thing that can be debated, but I think the impact is still the same.
Cart before the horse, though. Like, yeah, they do that after the fact, but they didn't create a war to get this amount of profits. There's so many other ways they can make money. This is ridiculous. Like, it's impossible to not raise insurance on ships when there's a battle.
Just really quickly off of what Ryan said, if that's okay. So there was actually an announcement this morning. I don't know if you guys covered it. I apologize. Like I said, in and out. Tasnim quoted an Iranian intelligence source saying, there is no truth to what is being promoted about our willingness to negotiate with U.S. intelligence. This has actually come out several times today. They are making it abundantly clear that they are not negotiating.
Nor should they. They've been preemptively attacked 3 times. You can't negotiate with these people. And it's under the guise of negotiations that they got hit with a surprise attack. And again, even when they agreed, all right, you can have our enriched uranium that they got up to 60%, Israel preemptively attacked. You can't talk to these people. They're not losing this war. I mean, they're taking damage. They are taking it on the chin, but they're delivering too. And a stalemate is still a loss for the U.S. The invincibility is gone. They can't sell their defense. Oh, we'll protect you. That's already dead. That's already dead. Look at Bahrain and Kuwait. That's over. They're going to have to pack up and Yankee go home.
Yeah, for several days, Ryan and I were going over this every single strike, and I kept saying that's logistics, that's supply chain, that's logistics. You're looking at repair parts, you're looking at fuel, you're looking at resupply points, and that's what they've been systematically just decimating. And a note there, Simon gave us a great perfect announcement on that.
Andrew.
And then, please don't interrupt me. And then what Ryan brings in is this is what I'm glad that Alex brought up here. And that is, I mean, Ivy brought up, is we need to get a really back and forth between Ryan and Simon to really get a good look at this. But yeah, I hear what Ryan's saying.
There's no back and forth. I don't have to shift what I say. Like if the military wins, he'll say it's the military industrial complex. If there's peace, he'll say it's the bankers. Like you just shift back and forth. I've been consistent. It's Zionism. They drug us into war. They took us to Iraq. They took us to Syria. They took us to Libya. You can see the policy papers. You can look at every fucking lie about WMDs came from Jewish neocons that dragged us into war. They wrote a script like Iran is next. This has been the plan, regardless of what was going on in the markets or not, because they planned this decades in advance. We are doing this for Israel. There's nothing to argue about. AIPAC wouldn't spend all these millions of dollars to set up pedophile rings and all that. It was automatic already. Like there's no plan. We're not coordinating with China to divide up the world. We are doing Israel's bidding, and it is costing America trillions of dollars and many lives. That's that. I mean, this is like saying the Civil War was started so the bullet manufacturers could sell a lot of bullets because both sides, you look at all the guns, like, yeah, bullets, they made bullets and they made profits, but that's not why we had a civil war at all. There's ideological reasons behind these wars, and Israel is the one that preemptively attacked Iran. Israel's the one that lied about Iraq. Israel's the one that helped orchestrate 9/11 with Al-Qaeda. Like, and they're freely flying into, and they're driving through Syria now to attack Lebanon because ISIS is on their side. Always was. That's always been the case. We are doing their bidding. You've got a bunch of Christian zealots like Pete Hegseth that thinks they're going to cause Armageddon and bring Jesus back. Like, these people are fucking nuts.
Yeah, but hold on. My position hasn't changed. My position is that this is moving to a multipolar world, that there will be a weaker Israel, a weaker Iran, and a weaker America in the region. America will be retreated into a regional power. The military will make up for lost profits in Europe and Central and South America. And there will be regional stability in the Middle East that's enforced through financial transactions and investments, and China will, the China will dominate this region. Now, the justification and the cause and effect and everything in between is up for debate. But my end position.
Why would America cede territory and resources to China? Just like here, you can
because
have
America is not a
sovereign.
sovereign country. It's controlled by corporate interests and it's controlled by lobbies.
Well, they ain't Chinese lobbies. It's the Israeli lobby.
Yeah,
you look at Larry Fink, you
transnational
look at BlackRock, you look at what do they all have in common?
Yeah, but
look
also
at the CEOs of Lockheed Martin.
No, I agree. I agree. While BlackRock's the most, they've got the most amount of assets under administration, but they're not a monolith. They have to. They've partnered with transnational capital, which consists of sovereign wealth funds in all sorts of countries, whether it be from Norway to the Gulf countries to the Singapore to China. And so it isn't just BlackRock that
Don't you think they can just invest in whoever's winning? Like they're not
exactly, and that's why they're dictating, because they're changing capital flows in order to usher in multipolarity, and that's the whole point. And so that's what capital markets are saying, and so the result is the same, which is that we don't have US dominance at the end of this. But the only difference, I think, is that some people believe that at the end of this, Israel's going to rule the entire world.
No, dude, I wish we do have these recorded somewhere. Like when the last conflict ended, you're like, yeah, see, that's what I thought. It's because big energy wants peace in the region. So that, and now, like, oh, fuck, it's not big energy anymore because the oil and gas has been stopped production and can't move around at all. Well, right. That's because financial insurance companies are ruling this time. Like you just sit in different chairs and it's, you got a different explanation for every event that happens. Whereas following Zionism explains them all at the same time. Well,
if it were true, then if Israel does rule the world and they're going to win, then Iran will lose and the whole world will end up in Pax Judaica. And we'll end up in a Zionist empire. That's what most people believe.
It's now, insane on its face.
Well, they're not going to win because they're physically losing the battle.
World. It's a tiny country. It has influence, but it is not, has never been, and would never be even a regional hegemon, let alone a global one.
Just to be clear, Ivy, I've gone live every single week on YouTube, so it is all recorded. But my end result has always been the same. It's been consistent all the way through. And when I was up on these spaces saying that the
U.S.
U.S.
remember me asking you if they go to war with Iran and America attacks Iran with Israel, you're going to change your mind? You're like, yeah. And they did it twice.
Yeah,
no mind change.
I will admit, Ryan, in the detail of the micro predictions, I think you've been more accurate and I've got things wrong. I've got things right. But the overall analysis, there was a time up here when no one would believe me when I said that America is no longer a global hegemon and this is actually going to weaken the dollar. And this is going to reset the world to a multipolar world order. At that time, that was violently opposed. And they say Israel rules the world, there's no chance that will happen. Now, my the macro analysis, I think, is still on track and is consistent. But yeah, the micro analysis in terms of who's going to do what, when it's going to happen, I'll get some details wrong. But I think, and I'll record it every week and I'll say what's wrong. But I also believe that I'm sharing the facts of power.
Acknowledge that America is being led around by the nose by the Israelis and that these wars wouldn't happen at all if not for them. No, but it's not corporate interest. It's ideological.
But that's not true.
America's going against their own interests. Like they were the global superpower. They're not going to be after this. They didn't want that.
But what I'm saying is America wouldn't be the global power if Israel didn't create the wars for it, because America is backed by war and the dollar has to be rolled over and it has to exert global hegemon power. And that is what is different.
That's so silly. You have it already in peace. The reason people leave the dollar is because of sanctions and war.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the way the dollar is structured is it's backed by war, it's backed by a military-industrial complex. It has to roll over the Ponzi scheme. It has to dump the debt on the American people. It has to find new ways of spending it. It has to pump it back into the US stock market. It has to create artificial demand for the dollar. It has to enforce nobody being able to compete with it. It has to enforce that the Middle East are not able to come up and do what they're doing right now. And that is the model structurally. Now, whether you have a communism, capitalism narrative, whether you have a fake war on terror narrative, whether you hire Israel to go out there and cause carnage, whether you do any of that, that is what the dollar requires. And the only reason we're having a change here is because it's hit the end. The banks are now diversifying into other countries because China rose and said, here's a competing model. The competing model is that you don't need a financial banking system that has to have war and has to be rolled over in a debt-based Ponzi scheme. And we can partner with countries. That's the change we're witnessing.
The flaw there is saying you have to have war. You don't. People were using the dollar. Japan uses the dollar. People use the dollar because it's tied to the largest labor market. It's easy to liquidate. And people use the dollar because it's the most accepted currency. When you have wars, you risk that. When you put sanctions on country and freeze their assets like they did Russia, like they did Venezuela, like you did Iran, that's when they start looking for a different currency to use, not only for oil transactions, but for all foreign trades.
I
Not having war, they already
agree
won.
with that,
They
but
had it
how
after
did
World War II, they already were the winner.
How did the
Doing
dollar?
all this conflict does the opposite of what you're saying.
No, yeah, I agree with that, because now it's no longer enforceable, because there is a competing power and people are able to say, I'll work with China and do a deal instead. And therefore China can exert influence that wasn't there before to create a competing power. But the dollar was not organic. It wasn't a better currency. It wasn't backed by gold. It wasn't any of those things. It was the International Monetary Fund.
They had the least volatility. That's why
it wasn't. It was the Bretton Woods system that enforced, through covert regime change, through death, destruction, rape, pillage, settler colonialism, everything that Israel is doing, everything that Epstein is doing, is what backs the dollar, is what caused the war continually. And it's ever since Bretton Woods system, when they enforced the world, when it enforced the world on the dollar and enforced the world to have the dollar to price oil, it wasn't organic. It was backed by war, death, destruction, and violence. And now it's no longer able to be enforced.
And gold.
You don't
Nixon
have
take
to
it off
use
the
the
gold
dollar.
standard?
It's not forced. You're not, other than Saudi Arabia, which has special contracts. You don't have to use dollars.
The IMF is
you
a
can do bilateral
mechanism.
trades. Countries do it all the time.
No, the IMF was a
This
mechanism.
isn't about petrodollars, any of that. It's about Israel. Like, we went to war for that. Like, it wasn't banks or anything saying that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons under his palaces. It was William Safire.
Yeah, and very useful
and
for
Judith Miller.
the dollar. So the IMF was
It's not.
the IMF was created in 1944 after World War II in order to enforce dollar dominance, to enforce it. It wasn't natural. You got regime change, you got color revolution, you got taken out, you got wiped out.
Common currency for trade. You don't think Venezuela would get on the dollar? You don't think that Russia would love to get back on SWIFT and use a dollar? They do. They want.
They would now, because it was initially enforced through war, death, destruction, violence, rape, pillaging, and everything you claim Israel is doing, which was always what backed the dollar.
It's not backed by war. It's harmed by war. That's why people want to get away from it. That's why after the first Gulf War, Saddam was trying to go to the euro once it was available. They'll do anything. The war and the sanctions harm the petrodollar monopoly. They don't back it. They don't enforce it.
It only
down.
harmed it when there was an alternative rail that was built through a competing power that built a manufacturing base called China. And before that, you had no choice. You just had to submit.
So you could just do bilateral trades, which people do all the time.
I completely agree. But America is backed by psychopathic Zionism war.
It's just because it works. Like, nobody in Thailand needs pesos from Mexico. They want to use dollars because it's the one for the global exchange.
Yes,
nobody wants to do little different nitpicky currency trades all day from each country to each country.
Once it's been enforced, it became the stable currency, just like the pound was. But once it can no longer be enforced, that's the issue. And it was the IMF 1,000% enforced the world onto dollar in order to make it where everyone else was printing their currencies. They got inflation, the economies were destroyed, and then they had to invest in these. And then with all that inbound capital, America pumped it into the stock market until they extracted all the wealth from the American people and created more wealth inequality. That's what the dollar was backed by. It was systemic.
You don't think the francs and crowns and other competing currencies had more volatility because of World War II and rebuilding their nations, where America was sitting pretty with all their cities intact? Like, they went to the dollar because they had less fluctuation. Nobody wants to do $1 billion trade. By the time you receive your good, you might have lost $1 million because of the currency hike. Like, they used it because it was more stable. It's more stable because they didn't lose the war.
They used it because America had a military-industrial complex that was selling all the weapons and didn't end up getting involved in the war, didn't have anything bombed. But what was the system that was set up prior to that? A chunk of Russia's gold ended up in America. A chunk of British gold and all the colonial mercantilism ended up in Fort Knox. A chunk of Germany's gold ended up in America. And once it had 75% of the world's gold, the backing of the pound no longer existed. So they managed to transition through World War I and World War II, and Zionism was a part of that, obviously. And then once that happened, America used its gold dominance and military dominance and its IMF system to say everybody has to convert their currency. You come off the gold standard and you have to borrow money from IMF. And they launched a Marshall Plan, and then they launched a Cold War in order to enforce debt destruction, this debt cycle, the same thing that the Bank of England did to Britain. And now the Federal Reserve did it to America. And now it's at the end of a debt cycle. And now people have choice because China said exactly what you said. You don't need to do it this way. You don't need to do it through war, death, destruction, rape, pillaging. You can actually trade and build up countries. And then countries suddenly said, okay, I'll sell my dollars. I'll buy some gold as reserves. And now I've got an alternative model with China. That's why everything's changing. And that's the only reason.
If you audit Fort Knox, there's very little there that they say is there.
Also,
because the Fed took that from Treasury too.
It would have worked, like you just admitted, since China's doing it. It works through peace anyway. It's not backed by war.
But America is a dominant culture that's backed by war.
What do you mean backed
No,
by
it
war,
has
Simon?
war. It's a warmongering culture, but it's not for the sake of the dollar. It's a warmongering culture in spite of the dollar. It's a warmongering culture because you have a bunch of religious psychopaths that ideologically believe that God gave a certain people land and that they deserve it. And they go in there and they're bombing these people. And there was no giant profiteering off of slaughtering Gaza. It's just pure ethnic cleansing so they could steal.
Yeah, but
It's just what they believe.
Yeah, but where did that come from? America was created
Zionism.
because before Zionism, a bunch of psychopathic British and Europeans were allegedly expelling religious persecution, and they did exactly what Gaza did. They ethnically cleansed, they genocided, they raped, pillaged, stole the land, and created the United States
Christian
of America.
manifest destiny. Same thing. Religious zealots stealing land.
They used,
God gave it to them.
In that case, they just said it was, it's our right as Christians, and we're going to civilize the land, and we're going to take those thugs. And then they did exactly what Israel does. Israel is just a personification of what the dollar has been backed by for its entire history, and the European and the British Empire.
Jewish supremacy. So was Christianity.
400 years of this shit we've had.
Right, and specifically, these wars, all these wars in the Middle East, have been based on Israeli policy papers with Israeli objectives and getting America to pay for it.
Getting Americans to pay for it while the American stockholders profited.
Yes, correct.
How did the dollar profit
getting
from the
Americans
Middle
without
East
health care to pay for it. Exactly.
How did the dollar benefit from the Middle East war, Simon?
Because what you do is that you print $10 trillion to roll over America's debt-based Ponzi scheme. Israel creates the environment that leads to the justification for war. The Middle East are no longer able to unify to create a competing power. And all of that $10 trillion went back into the US stock market with a bit clipped off by corrupt politicians that allowed it to happen. But all of the money ended back in the US stock market. And now 92% of institutional investors 92% of all the stock market value is owned by 10% of the people in America. And so now you can't extract more. But all the value went into extracting.
Yeah, but that value went, like you just said,
inflation in the dollar.
It ruined the dollar. It killed the dollar.
Absolutely, because they didn't care about America.
It wasn't backing it. And also you said, as you just admitted, it was a few people who benefited, the people who own the assets. So it didn't back the dollar. It ruined the dollar.
No, hold on. You've got to get this right. Internally, the purchasing power of the individual person was left with the debt, and all the value went up to the stockholders. That's what destroyed the dollar internally.
Yeah, that's not backing the empire. That's ruining the empire.
Relative to foreign currencies, it went up in value because it was enforced by the IMF system, debt war, covert wars, operations, the deep state, Zionism, all of that shit that enforced the world to purchase US treasuries because the dollar was strengthening relative to their currency. And so you had to invest it and lend it back to the US government through the most liquid bond market in the world that funded all the war and required more war in order to get that Ponzi scheme going. Because if ever what happens today happens, where other currencies, gold, strengthen relative to the dollar, then the whole thing reverses, the whole house of cards falls down. And that's exactly what we're witnessing right now.
Interesting.
Yeah,
go on, Ryan.
We're going to have a war, and it looks like Iran is winning. And there's not going to be a collapse of the dollar. None of this shit's going to happen. They're fighting, and they're fighting for Israeli interests, as they have been doing for the last 30 years. They literally wrote it down. They planned out all the wars. They picked all the countries that resist them, that they want the U.S. to go and destroy.
Well, the dollar...
wars in Africa or Latin America, whatever, that would work too. With the wars of war, we're always in the Middle East, and it's always them.
Well, no, before it was in Europe and it was communism versus capitalism. Before it was whatever, pick your ideology, whether it was Latin and Central America, whether it was Africa, whether it was Asia, whether it was Middle East. It's rape, steal, pillaging, and it's the same shit. Profiteering from war.
There's always been imperialism.
Exactly, but that's what backs the dollar.
It doesn't. It hurts the dollar.
You said
it's going to go in circles on this.
Simon, so the first half I understand. I didn't really understand the second half. So the first half I understand is this. So they printed $10 trillion. It went to the stock market and it caused inflation to the dollar. These things seem bad for the American empire, bad for the American
you've got to separate American
Can you explain that simpler for me?
You have to put America into American corporate interests, the stock market, and Americans. Americans are meant to take on the debt and end up with a weaker dollar internally. The American stockholders end up with all the value and they end up with all of the control. And then they're the ones that control the lobby so that they can control the politicians and make sure whenever that money is printed, it goes to their company. And the more you pay in a pay-to-play system, the more money you get into your stock and your interest. And so it's wealth extraction from the American people over to the American stockholder. And if you get the 0% money because you're a bank and you can print money, then you can utilize that system to ensure that Americans are left in individual debt, companies are left in corporate debt, and you can co-opt the companies by agreeing to issue them additional capital, and you can do it through the bond market. Bond holders rule. Shareholders rule. And guess what? $65 trillion of America is owned by foreign investors, and they're not all Israeli.
You can print money without a war and have inflation and get hold of it first and buy up real intrinsic goods and things. You don't need an excuse of a war in the Middle East. We have wars in the Middle East because of Israel.
You do have wars in the
You
Middle East
take
because
that
of
away.
Israel, and
The
America
reason
is
they
happy with
have
it.
a
Why do
huge
you think
lobby,
you've got these radicalized evangelical Christians that are utilized in order to make sure that that construct is propped up? Because it actually is what props up the empire.
because guess who decides who gets to be in power, and who do they want? They want obedient goy. The Christian Zionists, they want the Huckabees, they want the Hegseths. They're obedient. They do what Israel wants. They believe in that stuff. These are the people like everybody in Congress besides Massey and like 4 others has an AIPAC person. They control the elections. They own the media. I mean, it's just like flat out that you can genocide cities in front of the world and get away with it. No one else could act like that and pull that off. Only them.
Okay. Anyway, well, I've shared how America was backed and what's changed, and and now because there is a competing implementation, China's able to work with Iran. Iran's able to go through what it's going through, and we've had this change in world because America's not a sovereign country; it's run by the banks.
Well, would China have gotten that with Iran if America had not put sanctions on Iran and gone to war with Iran? How about this scenario? Fuck Israel. America just buys gas and oil from Iran. Everybody benefits. But they didn't.
Exactly.
Like they drove Iran into China's arms because of a policy that goes against American interests because they're favoring Israeli interests.
And I completely agree with that. But why? Because the financial institutions in America partnered with the sovereign wealth funds in China, and they're ushering in a multipolar world so they can hedge their bets, utilize the dollar for as long as they can, extract as much assets until Americans are just left with all the debt, and then they can move capital flows.
Right. But don't you see how they can do that? Because they can see that, like, not that they orchestrated it. They see that that's being orchestrated and they just side with whoever's winning. They're like, oh, well, it's China. We're going over here now. They see the policy directive. You look at like the people that actually make decisions, Trump, the people in Congress, like his cabinet and all that. It's a bunch of children. It's a bunch of Christian zealots and stuff. And they know like, oh, they're going to obey Israel. We know, oh, they're going to go to war with Iran. So they're like, all right, we get oil futures. We'll do this. And but they're not sitting down, smoking cigars and saying, let's divide up the world between China and America. They're like, America's about to lose a lot of territory because of its stupid decisions obeying Israel, and it's probably going to end up with the Chinese. So we're going to invest over there. But it wasn't a plan to get rid of all that leverage they had and just hand it to China.
But that's not what they're doing. It's making America. But what I'm saying is they need to diversify their returns. Yes, they hedge. They hedge for every single position. Yes, they have inside information. And yes, Israel was good for their war profiteering. And that Zionism ideology helped them a lot. And it helps a lot for them extracting wealth from the American people over to the American stockholder. And now that they've got to consider other players, it's not that they sat down and have a plan. It's that China said, and the sovereign wealth fund said, that we would like this to happen and we would like a new plan. And here's the profits you can make if you make it happen. Now go down to your power structure, the Zionist military industrial complex. And, it's capital flows that ultimately is determined. Of course, there's ideology. Of course, there's a bunch of radicals that were all radicalized in order to facilitate the profiteering as useful idiots because they didn't know who they were working for. But who ultimately is benefit from this is capital. It's the one that ends up with all the wealth. And Israel right now is being privatized, is being carved up for private interest. And if they actually wanted to do what China did, it would all be national interest and it would all be nationalization. But it's not. It's being, it's a useful tool for committing crimes against humanity, testing technology, using the Palestinians as a laboratory, using North and Central, Northern Africa to test and create brochures. And anytime you need to do something illegal, anytime you need plausible deniability, go get Israel to do it. And they'll believe that we're the ethical people in America and the Jews rule the world. And so when you have your divorce, you've got your plausible deniability. And then Tucker Carlson can come out and expose as a CIA asset exactly the Zionism controls everything. And now it's acceptable to believe that. So they start pushing the algorithms and let Nazis come on spaces and share all this different stuff because they want everyone to believe that.
I'm not one of these people that blames the Jews. I'm not saying Jews are in the world. Agree. And this is what's going on now. Like it's on the ground. They're invading Lebanon. They need to be destroyed.
All good. Let's end on a point of definite agreement. Israel's a cancer. Israel's a crime against humanity. Israel needs to be destroyed. Let's hope that
so is Christian Zionism.
Yeah,
like all these people that believe in end times Armageddon nonsense, like that they should never have power over anything. These are lunatics. Whether you think there's a secret banker manipulating them or whatever, they're the ones actually making the decisions and doing these things. So I'm going to blame it on them. And they should never have power. And Hegseth is insane. He's got like cross tattoos and stuff all over his body. He thinks this is a crusade. The stuff that like ISIS does, they blame on Muslims in general, which is just as stupid, blaming Jews in general. They're like, oh, that's what the Muslims did. All this crap we've heard about Iran, like, oh, do you know the Ayatollah wanted to rape women in prison? Like, oh, really? That's what Israel actually does. They're raping the men in prison. What do you think happens to Palestinian women in a jail in Israel? I don't even want to think about it. We all know what they do. These people rape. These Epstein rings, you talk about these hedge fund managers and stuff, which I can name them all. I'm not going to do it again, but guess what? They have in common. And they rape little kids. These are monsters. And it just gives me great joy in a kind of guilty way to watch Tel Aviv burn, because I don't know another solution. You can't negotiate. You can't reason with psychopaths. They used to be like, at least the Americans, they had to hide it. Like, they had to lie about Iraq. They had to lie about Syria. In Israel, they're like, just, yeah, ethnic cleansing, hooray. They're all for it. Americans didn't like ICE shooting 2 civilians, so 3, 2 dead. They didn't like it. Like, some 80% don't want this war in Iran, don't see the point. But in Israel, they love it. The more Arabs you can kill, and they don't even differentiate between Persians and Arabs, the better. It is a psychotic society. It is a rotten cancer. It is an ideology of religious supremacy. It needs to be erased. I don't know how to get rid of it. It's like radical Judaism, which is what Israel is. And it's just a train wreck between all the worst forces of hedonism, profiteering, religious bigotry, all wrapped in one. And you end up with the Zionists. And they engage in ethnic nepotism. They don't rule the world, but they run the United States media, which runs politicians. And it's not just the bribes and AIPAC. It's obviously blackmail rings. We've been covering it. There's subpoenas now. You can look at them. Lutnick and all these billionaires. These are the top fish. And they're all raping kids. And it's run from an Israeli intelligence operation. That's what Maxwell and Epstein were. So it's like, they do have a lot of power. Saying they run the world, they don't run China, they don't run Japan, they don't run Asia at all. It's not the world, but it's a big chunk. And it's the United States, like a parasite to a host. But they don't run the American public. Not anymore. They used to have over 50%. Not anymore. Not after October 7th. That's the one good thing that came out of this, at a huge human sacrifice, is the scales fell from people's eyes. They're like, why are you bombing hospitals? Wait, what are you doing? This is disproportional. Even Piers Morgan woke up. And that's the only way we're going to get out of this mess, is you have to stop supporting that insane ideology, which I agree has gone all the way back to the Christian bigotry, killing Native Americans. I know. All that, in whatever form, has to die.
Amen, brother. In that we agree. But I think we can also agree that, right now, I personally believe that Israel and the Zionists still have a bunch of power, and we're finding out whether that power can be overcome by Iran, or whether there's, in the end, going to be something that recognizes that Israel has power, Iran needs to exist. And I just can't Israel suddenly, the world power as it exists today allows Israel to just disappear, America to look weak, and Iran to be shown as the ethical winner. I think that's something I'd love to see.
At the same time, I can't see China letting Iran fall either. I think what the off-ramp, if they start to lose, is America removes the footprint from the Middle East and does sanction relief. And Trump can say, well, we destroyed their Navy and we got their missiles and pack up and walk. But that's not going to prevent Iran from continuing to hit Israel. Like, they've really, really screwed up on this one. They bit off more than they can chew. And I love it.
Yeah, I agree. I think there will be sanction relief. I think China's a player. A very important player. I just don't see how this doesn't end in some kind of America having their narrative, Israel having their narrative, and Iran having their narrative.
Well, it's going to be difficult. But, without the eye in the sky and sharing satellite data with Iran, they would not be, from which the Chinese have provided, they wouldn't have the success they're having. Like, that is vital. It doesn't seem like, oh, they satellites. Well, yeah, that's how they know what they're hitting and how successful it was. They can see straight down. And that's because of China. China is very dependent on Middle Eastern oil. They don't want this war to be long. They didn't want it to happen at all. But they cannot allow Iran to fall, because that would give the U.S. and Israel all of it. They control the Gulf. China would be fucked. So they have a vested interest in Iran pulling this off. They don't need to jump in. Iran is winning. We've gone over it a million times. Like, the U.S. is running out of munitions. They're going to have to come up with some kind of base-saving off ramp soon. They've got about 5 days left, in my opinion. And they're going to have to pull something out. And I think what they're going to do is they're going to leave these little Gulf Arab states and say, okay, we're out. But, like, what are they going to get in return? Because you said, like, they're going to have their narrative. That's a question mark. Like, what? Why? Okay, you're going to suspend your enrichment or something, which they were doing anyway. But I don't know. I don't know what the return could be. It all kind of depends on, like, how successful Israel is in Lebanon too. Like, well, okay, we'll get this land back or something. I don't see what the leverage they have. I don't know what Iran wants. They want sanction relief, and they want the U.S. to get their bases out of their adjacent territories. But what's the U.S. going to get out of this? It's total embarrassment for Trump. He's going to get swept in the midterms with this botched war plus Epstein. Their whole party's screwed.
Yeah, here's where I think there's a bit of nuance. I agree China can't have Iran fall. and I agree that. But is there a faction of power, a different faction of power within Iran? And I think there is. I think there's the IRGC that are going all in, all hard, all ideological in it till the end. And then there is a reformist faction, which I think China is aligned with, that wants regional stability and integration with the GCC and integration with the region. And I think that's where China, America, the GCC are aligned with that faction. And that's where I think, is the IRGC going to win, or is the China integrated America reformist version of Iran going to win?
They kind of had two chances already, and Israel just kept attacking. If they don't polish them off, they're just going to reload and attack Iran again for a fourth time. So the IGRC is the faction. There is no negotiation about this anymore. They were very measured after April, very measured after June. This is the third time. They're not going that route because they understand they're liars and you can't negotiate with them. They did everything. They allowed in the IAEA. They inspected weapons. They let them play around with the enrichment levels and all that. They offered it all. And during negotiations, the Americans and Israelis hit them twice. Now for the third time, no. They need to physically win this war, and then they can issue the demands.
But what if this ends up with an agreement that also has, American bases leaving, the GCC countries hedging with, China, Russia, and America, and then security guarantees by China and GCC in terms of enforcing whatever is agreed in the agreement?
I would say that, like, assuming Iran wins, which they might not, but if things stay the way the pace they're at right now, they're going to win. More than they want American bases out of the Gulf is they want sanction relief. Like, that's their number one. They might accept just that, but I think they can get both. It all depends on the outcome of the war.
That was a great conversation, actually.
Simon and I should just do our spaces.
Yeah.
I
support that. Yeah, that really was top notch. It was. Simon had some more questions, but it's up to you. You don't have to reopen anything if you don't want to.
Yeah, let's do it. Sorry, I got a bit of a lag on my unmute button.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so I was trying to understand, because it's an interesting one, and I thought about it myself, because I've had that conversation before with others, about if war is good for, like, the dollar, for the empire, that kind of stuff, right? And so my understanding of what you were saying so far, and I agree with it, and I thought that myself, which is, but it seems negative, right? Because you go to war, you print the money comes in, and it pumps up the assets, which are owned by a few people, but it ruins in my opinion, like, the word ruins the currency by inflating it, making the cost of living for everyone go up, and kind of eroding and weakening, in my opinion, the power of the empire. I understood your next step, which was all that money is collected by those asset owners, and then they own the lobbies, and then they print more, and with the money printing, they enslave everyone to debt. And something about bonds, I didn't explain. I didn't quite catch that part. And I guess, is that enslavement part of what's benefiting the empire? Like, but it's not an empire. It's just a few people. It's a cabal that's dominating everyone. Is that it? Or is
it also changes, right? So, for example, the Gulf countries co-opted BlackRock, not to full, but in order to exert influence, you can just buy significant shares. And so the Q80 Sovereign Wealth Fund became one of the larger foreign holders of BlackRock. And then you're able to exert by doing like an IPO like Saudi Aramco, where you can partner with the investment bank, and then the investment bank gives you a board seat. And then you're able to exert what's right, what you want for your country, not own it, not control it, but you're able to use your influence and your money and your investment in order to influence American foreign policy. And so while most people think like Gulf countries are just subordinate to Zionism, that was just a reality of Israel being a tool for American military to destroy the region. But over time, the countries went through different strategies. Obviously, Iran went down its path, and Saudi went down its path, avoided assassination, had all the different attempts, went down a more Wahhabi radicalist funding, training terrorist groups, but then went back to reformists. And eventually you hit the point where, as America gets weaker, your influence grows, and you're able to because Zionism's strength is based upon American strength. So if America falls, Zionism needs to then go and find a new partner, which is obviously India and UAE. But I've gone off topic here, but what I'm saying is, it's people think of things as they've always been. But the second the dollar is not world reserve currency, which currently it's the largest currency, but it's not world reserve currency because gold is now the largest asset, and we're at the stage where Cayman Island, via hedge funds, is the largest lender to the US government. you're not sovereign anymore. And so, you know, that means that power is dynamic and shifts based upon how well you play the geopolitical game. And so you can buy your way out through foreign direct investment to be able to influence foreign policy. And we talk about APAC, but APAC has many other lobbies. And there's covert influence as well. So most people will focus on the fact that Jared Kushner manages Affinity Capital Partners. They'll say, oh, that's evidence of Zionist control, which is correct. There's a Zionist element to it. But that's the manager. The manager is subordinate to the board, and the board is subordinate to the shareholder. So who's the shareholders of Affinity Capital? Well, that's the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds. And so they can inject billions into Affinity Partners, and then they can control foreign policy, not just through APAC funding, which is tiny money, you know, 50 to 100 million, and plus all the Zionist billionaires. But their money is insignificant relative to a 50-year regional stability fund that benefits from regional stability. And therefore, you can exert influence and use Jared Kushner as your manager. Because remember, managers are subordinate to shareholder class. And so you can then exert influence given the reality that Israel is there. And there ain't nothing like you can then have Iran weaken Israel like they are right now. And then someone else can come in and acquire a lot of the assets. And that's why you have this good cop, bad cop relationship between UAE and Saudi Arabia. But everyone's still on the old narrative of they're all under the boot of Zionism. They were under the boot of Zionism because that was a division of the US military industrial complex. And if you don't want to be bombed, you have to put a base in your region. Now that base is being attacked. And so what I'm saying is people think that 5D chess is exclusive to West. It's actually other players that are playing chess as well. And we're used to this Western dominated American supremacist ideology, but that's not the reality anymore. And so does that mean that Zionism continues to fang? Because I would argue that Zionism was a function of Western power, whether it be British imperialists to American imperialists. And so if you're resetting that board, then Zionism loses a chunk of power. But that wasn't the question. I think you were asking about what you were asking about. What? Sorry, can you ask the question again, Adam?
No, that was a great discussion there. So my question was more around specifically war being bad for the empire and for the dollar. I think from what I understand from what you're saying, it makes me think, you know, it was good for a rootless international clique. Because I agree with your structure of how things are set up. Like there's, you know, capital at the top and then you have managers. But it seems that the rapacious nature of the empire was good only for that rootless clique. It wasn't good for the empire. It wasn't good for the dollar because, like I mentioned before, the dollar was, you know, it was gold backed, removed in the 70s by Nixon, and then obviously the Federal Reserve printing money ruined it, and it might have made many people, not many people, it might have made this group richer than everyone else combined. But strategically, over a long time since World War II, you know, because after World War II, like the world had gone through 2 world wars, these people had discovered this whole continent with bountiful resources. Everyone else was broke, you know, so there was a massive boom period. It became the #1 superpower on earth. But I don't think it was because of war. I think it was just because of the natural state of things. And I think that if they had taken a more, you know, bilateral trade and leadership and statesmanly approach, then they would still be the #1 power. Then they still would be, the empire would still be at its zenith. It wouldn't be dying. It wouldn't be about to be over. It wouldn't be China moving on and all that good stuff. So I feel like war itself was like kind of, not backed.
So I completely agree with that ideology, but that wasn't the Western European American ideology. It was an ideology based upon mercantilism and domination and removal of competition. And so when you come from an ideology of removal competition, dominate, we must control, and mercantilism combined, which is the extraction of resources through fiat currency. And so what mercantilism was, it was how the British Empire was built. You use fiat currency in order to print money to fund wars so that you end up with the hard money of gold at the end of it, because no one holds the fiat currency because it goes down in value. So the idea of a fiat currency is to extract value over an empire until eventually you burden all the debt on the people. And that's what the central banking system is. So when the Bank of England did it, the British Empire fell when the debt burden was so much and the world got so complicated through controlling all of the different colonies that everyone started uprising and they could no longer exert their influence. And then the same people that created the Bank of England then went and set about, what is the power dynamics of the world today? How do we do a transition to the American empire? And how do we set up a Federal Reserve System? And so European powers, like, you know, wealthy billionaire Zionists like Rothschilds, partnered with American power, like the Rockefellers and the Morgans, and their wealth was achieved through oil. And then you created this whole through World War I and World War II. They built a manufacturing base that meant that America could supply all the weapons, and Russia did the same. And so now you had two military-industrial complexes that were profiteering from war. But the mechanism, you can then use that war in order to enforce your currency upon your colonies. And so, for example, a classic example is Germany during World War II, when it invaded the Czechoslovakia. The Bank for International Settlements had and the Federal Reserve System. They had similar governance structures. They had the Warburg brothers on the board of both the Reichsbank and the Federal Reserve. And so when Germany was invading Czechoslovakia, their gold was stored at the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve and the Swiss Central Bank. But when they invaded Czechoslovakia, they called up the Bank for International Settlements. And the Bank for International Settlements was both funding British effort in the war, but also transferring Czechoslovakia's gold to the Hitler Nazi regime. And so you simultaneously get both sides. But what did they do? They took the gold, and rather than move it from the Bank of England, think about this. The Bank of England was holding the gold that was funding part of the Hitler regime. And it was waging war against it from the same British Empire. And so what did they do? They effectively agreed to say, this gold used to belong to Czechoslovakia, now it belongs to Germany. And then eventually we had the outcome of the war, and that gold ended up in Fort Knox. But by changing the ownership of gold, you use a fiat currency in order to extract the real resources. And those resources are the means of production, whether it be oil right now, or whether it be semiconductor chips in AI, or whether it be silver in solar panel components or whatever. But a fiat currency is a mechanism for using your military to enforce your currency on the countries that have the resources. And then you take those resources and you don't hold the currency, you end up with the hard money or the stocks that go up in value. And so by printing money, the average person ends up holding money in their bank, taking on debt. But that money is effectively used in order to acquire the resources and the assets and the shares. That means that you outperform the inflation while everyone that's holding the dollars ends up on the wrong side and in debt. And so it's a mechanism for turning every American person into a debt holder through mortgages, credit cards, student loans, whatever. The corporations that comply with the finance houses, the investment banks, they get basically corporate debt and equity stimulus. And the country, the government, by controlling the government, you use your lobby power in order to enforce that the money that is printed by selling government bonds ends up back into the stockholders' interests. And so the bond markets rule the market, the equity holders rule the market, and you are a product. And this is inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed, because how is the dollar created? It's created by borrowing it into existence. And so a dollar is created when you take out a loan or a mortgage or a credit card. The dollar is created when a company issues a bond via an investment bank and they get to purchase it. And when the government borrows, then that's how these dollars are actually created. The government doesn't create the money. It issues a bond through the Federal Reserve, and the bank purchases it with newly created money. So they're able to purchase free money. So whoever can create free money ends up ruling the system and controlling the military, the technology, all the companies, all the board seats, all the lobbies, all the politicians, Senate, Congress, and can have a deep state under the military that controls the CIA, Mossad, MI6, and can run an Epstein blackmail operation in order to get everyone subordinate to your structure. And then you have colonies around the world that enforce that. And in the Middle East, Israel was that colony. And so it's all connected to, the propping up of the dollar. And why do you do things via a proxy like Israel? Because you have plausible deniability. Just like you say, it wasn't us, it was those crazy radicalist ISIS Muslims. It wasn't us, it was those crazy radicalist, Zionist Jews. It wasn't us, it was those crazy blackmailed Epstein class evangelical Christian Zionists that took the money and engaged in pedophilia. But you get plausible deniability for the whole system. And then once the whole system breaks, i.e. everyone's in debt, the corporate debt can't be propped up by money printing, then what you do is you do a radical devaluation of the currency, which puts all the capital out of that country into other countries. And then you start the process again. And so in this iteration, it went from the British Empire to the American Empire. The British was left with all the debt, and all the assets went to the banker class. And then the same has happened with American Empire. And now they're looking at creating a new mechanism called ETFs, where when you can't control the currency, You can control access to capital by managing everyone's pension, insurance premiums, and mortgage-backed securities, various other things. But you can control a country by exerting capital inflows and capital outflows. And a country can fight back by keeping their own resources, which is why there's a war with Iran, because Iran nationalized its resources when British Petroleum owned them. And then America or the empire engineers all these stories that justify war, i.e., create strategic tension between Iran and Israel, fund proxies, and have different military bases. And so you engineer the environment of funding every side of a war and having leverage and control until eventually a competing power resists and you have to negotiate with that competing power, which is China. And that's how did they get power to take on the dollar? Well, BRICS formed a unified...
By doing it the proper way, right? By doing it literally the opposite of what they were doing, right? The opposite of this printing and getting for nothing.
Exactly, and this is unmercantilism. So what does China do? China says, we'll keep our own central bank, we won't privatize it. We'll have state banks that effectively print money only in the interest of the local Chinese community. And then we'll take that money back and we'll reinvest it in infrastructure and making China authoritarian, controlled, not a democracy, but better for everybody. And so China did the opposite. And then China took that model and said, well, why don't we decolonize the world from the IMF? And so they created the Belt and Road Initiative and said, here, why don't you take a loan structured to purchasing goods from us? And because we've got this massive manufacturing base that isn't being depleted by banksters and currency speculators, where all of the value ends up in private banking interest, we don't mind investing in you so that you can then build an economy. And the more you grow, the more goods you purchase from us. And so that is
Simon,
reverse mercantilism.
Yeah, no, but isn't China doing mercantilism? It's just doing it much harder, while the West essentially isn't doing mercantilism anymore.
The difference is America did private banking interest that controls everything, and so only has a privatization strategy. And so mercantilism is used in order to extract private interest from the people, and the people just become products and debt and collateralized debt obligations. Whereas China said the private interest will never supersede the government, and the government, when it does mercantilism, it will always reinvest it back in its people and back in its partners.
Okay, wait.
I
have to object to that, because here's the main difference between the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy, the U.S. government budget does do mass wealth redistribution, but it does it to its people. It does it through Medicaid, Medicare, the Social Security system. There's massive, and this is the bulk of our budget, is that we're essentially just investing in, quote, the people, like you would say. China does the opposite. China's social welfare system is absolutely bare bones, minimal. It's like nothing compared to what it is in the West when you look at the percentage of the government spending. But what they do in China is massive corporate welfare for all of their industry. And this is how they're able to be so mercantilist and able to have such export dominance, because the Chinese government invests such a huge portion of the tax money into subsidizing and building up and promoting these industries so that the industries can sell at the cheapest prices in the world, right?
Here's the difference. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security is just a mechanism for extracting value over to the fund managers. And so the fund manager ends up with all the value and they manage the assets. And so it's a special subsidy for private interest. Whereas the banks in China are state banks that are controlled by state interest. And then what they have is a mechanism, and you may be right. I mean, there's things they get wrong, and it does lead to malinvestment. And maybe they don't focus on the right things. But the difference is that all the value is maintained within the country, rather than having these private interests that end up with all the value. And the reason they do that is because what we're seeing right now is that the government is subordinate to those financial interests through lobby and capital accumulation. And so now you end up in a situation where whoever buys American assets controls America, and whoever buys the American government controls America. And then they start using America for their own interests globally. And that's what's happening right now.
Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but let me put it this way. So the United States pays out this enormous, trillions of dollars in welfare, both in the medical system and outside of the medical system. For example, food stamps alone, it's like $100 billion a year. And when we give all this money to people, and mostly like poor people, but not entirely, they can spend that on anything. And it's consumerism, and they do it with consumption. They spend it disproportionately on consumption, right? Because the poorer someone is, the more they consume with what money they do have. and they can consume anything. There's no limitation on it. So they buy products not only from the United States, but also imports. And this drives America as a net importer. Whereas China, by taking that money and focusing it on its export-driven industries, it's taking its money and it's not subsidizing imports, it's subsidizing exports. So it's the exact opposite. So you end up with a situation where China is the mass producer and America is the mass consumer. Does that sound right?
Yeah, exactly that. And the key to sustainability for the people is to do what the corporate interests do. So the corporate interests, they take their money and they use it to invest in assets that outperform inflation, whereas the consumer in America takes it and buys things that are value destruction. And so they don't end up ever beating inflation. And so now the vast majority of Americans don't beat inflation, whereas everyone in China owns their own real estate, like 99% or something, and they've got savings. And so they're able to outperform the inflation. While as in America, because it's a Ponzi scheme by nature and it's privatized, those that get to issue the money at 0%, which is the private banks, they end up with all the assets and Americans end up with all the debt, unless you're incredibly savvy and you don't use your money to consume and you use your money to purchase assets. But unfortunately, because you get this inflation side effect, most Americans are now dependent upon consumption through credit cards.
Yeah. So put simply, it's like it's about keeping the money printer on as long as possible and getting as much something as you can get for nothing. Whereas China went the other way, the proper way, which is you're supposed to produce something to get something, and it's more of a Ponzi scheme on the American side. So we can, because yeah, like we've outlined, you print the money, you keep the world poor. So they have to keep giving you real things for printed money. But yeah, it's not a good long-term strategy.
And then you're radicalized into believing that there's something called capitalism versus communism, when the reality is there's just resources and how those resources are distributed and who benefits from them. And so the whole psyop of capitalism versus communism was really just the justification for this mercantilist extractive model. And then anytime you try and do some distribution, you're called a radical lefty. And guess what? Both win by the banks, because the left ideology, when you invest more in social welfare programs, end up with the asset managers or the insurers managing the money. And then if you go to the other side, you get a deregulation environment where all the money goes to the shareholder class and the lobby class. And so both systems are value extractive, because at the base, the Federal Reserve System is a debt-based Ponzi scheme that is designed, inevitable, predictable, guaranteed, to end exactly where we are today, where you devalue the currency and all the assets have been extracted into fewer and fewer hands. And then private control takes over and resets the order by negotiating with foreign interests, which is why I believe in the debate we had, transnational capital is sending the world into a multipolar world. And they have the ability, via their control of the US military industrial complex, to engineer a war and use their colonies like Israel and even, groups like ISIS and all these different ideologies that they create in order to fuel the tensions. Strategic tension was a game. It's got a name. Read the book by Paul Williams called Operation Gladio. It's where you create these stay-at-home militia armies, you fund every side, and you create strategic tension. Iran and Israel is a perfect example. For 40 years, they never blow each other up, but they create the environment that justifies $10 trillion of war.